November 20th, 2025. Kodiak bear kills pastor during Sunday service at remote Alaskan chapel. The morning of November 20th, 2025, dawned grey and bitter across Kodiak Island, Alaska. Snow had fallen steadily for 3 days, blanketing the remote fishing community of Uzinki in 18 inches of pristine white that muffled all sound except the persistent howl of Arctic wind through the spruce trees. At 47 degrees north latitude, the sun would barely climb above the horizon before beginning its descent back into the long Alaskan winter night, casting everything in perpetual twilight that seemed to seep into the bones of the island's 165 permanent residents. St. Mary's Chapel sat at the northern edge of Uzinki, a modest wooden structure built in 1947 by Norwegian fishermen who had settled the area after World War II. The chapel's white clapboard siding had weathered to a soft grey, and its small steeple bore a simple wooden cross that had survived countless storms blowing in from the Gulf of Alaska. The building measured just 30 feet by 40 feet, with 12 rows of handmade pews that could accommodate perhaps 60 people on the rare occasions when every resident attended service. On this particular Sunday morning, 23 souls had braved the weather to gather for worship, including Pastor Gregory Michael Holloway, a soft-spoken man of 42 who had ministered to this isolated flock for the past 7 years. Gregory had arrived in Uzinki in the spring of 2018, fresh from a comfortable suburban parish in Anchorage, where he had served families who drove SUVs and worried about soccer schedules. The transition to island life had been jarring initially, but he had grown to love the stark beauty of Kodiak Island and the resilience of its people. His wife Sarah had adapted more slowly, often staring across the grey waters toward the mainland, with a longing that Gregory pretended not to notice. Their daughter Emma, now 15, had initially rebelled against the isolation, but had eventually found her place among the handful of island teenagers, spending her afternoons helping the elderly residents with errands and learning traditional crafts from the native Alutiiq women who remembered when Uzinki was still primarily a subsistence fishing village. The chapel's interior was warm despite the brutal cold outside, heated by a wood-burning stove that Gregory had loaded with split spruce before dawn. The familiar scent of burning wood mixed with the lingering aroma of coffee from the small kitchen where Martha and Helen Cole, twin sisters aged 78, had prepared refreshments for after the service. The Cole sisters had been born on Kodiak Island and had never lived anywhere else, their weathered faces mapping 8 decades of island storms and salmon runs. They moved with the careful precision of people who had learned to conserve energy through long winters, their matching grey coats buttoned to the throat and their white hair pulled back in identical buns. In the third row sat Viktor Petrov, a commercial fisherman who had emigrated from Russia in 1991, with nothing but determination and a willingness to work 18-hour days on the Bering Sea. Now 56, Viktor owned 2 boats and employed 8 men during salmon season. But the harsh life had left him with arthritis that ached in weather like this. His wife Anya sat beside him, her small hand resting on his thick forearm as she listened to Gregory's sermon with the intensity of someone who had learned English as a second language and didn't want to miss a single word. Near the back of the chapel, Thomas and Rebecca Mitchell sat with their 3 young children. Thomas worked as a maintenance supervisor for the Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, responsible for monitoring the remote weather stations scattered across the archipelago. Rebecca homeschooled their children, 8-year-old David, 6-year-old Sarah and 4-year-old Michael, in the small apartment above the island's only general store. The children fidgeted in their wooden pew, whispering to each other in the way children do when they're trying to be quiet but can't quite manage it. Young Michael had been drawing pictures of bears in the margins of his coloring book, using a stubby red crayon to create creatures with enormous teeth and claws that seemed to leap off the page. Dr. James Kowalski occupied the second row, his medical bag never far from reach even during Sunday service. At 64, James was the island's only physician, serving a territory that encompassed not just Uzinki, but several other remote communities accessible only by bushplane or boat. His weathered hands had delivered babies, treated heart attacks, and sewn up countless fishing injuries over the past 25 years. His wife Margaret sat beside him, her silver hair catching the light from the chapel's simple windows as she followed along in her worn leather Bible, lips moving silently as she read the familiar passages. The Anderson family filled most of the fourth row, Carl and Linda with their 4 teenage children. Carl managed the island's small airstrip and fuel depot, crucial work that connected Uzinki to the outside world. His eldest son, Jake, 17, had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude and spent most afternoons working on the various engines that kept island life functioning. The younger children, 15-year-old Anna, 13-year-old Mark, and 11-year-old Lisa, attended the small island school where a single teacher managed students from kindergarten through high school graduation. Behind them sat elderly Robert Haugen, 82 years old and one of the original Norwegian settlers still living on the island. Robert had been a commercial fisherman for 60 years before age, and a heart condition forced him to retire. He lived alone in a small cabin near the harbor, maintaining independence that worried his friends, but which he guarded fiercely. His pale blue eyes, clouded slightly with cataracts, still held the sharp intelligence that had kept him alive through decades of dangerous work on the North Pacific. The Williams family occupied the fifth row. Daniel, a Coast Guard petty officer stationed at the small facility that monitored shipping traffic through the area, and his wife Jennifer, who taught at the island school. Their twin boys, both age 9, sat between their parents with the restless energy of children who would rather be outside building snow forts than sitting through Sunday service. Jennifer kept one hand on each boy's shoulder, a practiced gesture that conveyed both affection and gentle restraint. Near the front sat Maria Santos, a social worker who had arrived on the island 6 months earlier as part of a state program to provide mental health services to rural communities. At 34, Maria was still adjusting to island life after growing up in urban California. She found the isolation both challenging and strangely peaceful, though she worried about the toll that long winters took on the mental health of residents, particularly the elderly who lived alone. Gregory stood at the simple wooden pulpit he had built himself, his tall frame slightly stooped from years of ducking through low doorframes in island buildings. His graying brown hair was neatly combed, and his blue eyes reflected the genuine warmth that had endeared him to his congregation. He wore his best suit, a navy blue wool that Sarah had insisted he buy before they moved to Alaska, though it had seen better days after 7 years of island weather and the physical demands of rural ministry. The text for this Sunday's sermon came from Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Gregory had chosen this passage deliberately, knowing that his congregation faced another long winter with its attendant challenges of isolation, brutal weather, and the constant awareness that they were utterly dependent on each other for survival. Friends, Gregory began, his voice carrying easily through the small chapel, when the psalmist speaks of lifting his eyes to the mountains, he's acknowledging something we know intimately here on Kodiak Island. We are surrounded by wilderness, by forces of nature that dwarf our human plans and ambitions. The mountains, the sea, the weather, they remind us daily of our smallness, our vulnerability. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the chapel's weathered walls. The building creaked and groaned like a ship at sea, sounds so familiar to the congregation that they barely registered them consciously. Snow continued to fall, the flakes growing larger and more insistent as the storm system that had been brewing over the Gulf of Alaska for the past week began to intensify. Gregory continued his sermon, his voice steady and reassuring. But the psalmist doesn't find his help in the mountains themselves. The mountains are beautiful, yes, and they fill us with awe, but they are also dangerous. They can crush us with avalanches, freeze us with their cold, lose us in their vastness. The help comes not from the mountains, but from the one who made them. In the woods surrounding the chapel, approximately 200 yards to the northeast, a massive Kodiak brown bear moved through the snow with surprising silence. The animal was a mature male, weighing close to 1,200 pounds, and standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, even on all fours. His winter coat was thick and dark brown, almost black in places, with silver-tipped guard hairs that caught what little light filtered through the overcast sky. This was Scar, as he had been designated by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologists, who had been tracking him for the past 3 years. The name came from the distinctive claw marks that ran from his left ear down to his jaw, souvenirs from a territorial dispute with another male bear during the 2023 breeding season. Scar should have been in hibernation by now. Adult male Kodiak bears typically denned in October or early November, settling into carefully chosen caves or excavated dens where they would sleep through the worst of the winter months. But this year was different. The unusual weather patterns had disrupted the salmon runs that normally allowed bears to build up the fat reserves necessary for a long winter's sleep. Many bears across the archipelago were still active, desperately foraging for any available food sources to sustain them through the coming months. The bear had been moving through this area for the past week, following scent trails and investigating any potential food sources. His keen sense of smell, 7 times more acute than that of a bloodhound, had detected the unusual concentration of human scent around the chapel building. More intriguingly, he had caught the aroma of food, coffee, baked goods, and other appealing smells that emanated from the small kitchen where the Cole sisters had been preparing refreshments. Kodiak brown bears are the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world, and Scar was an exceptional specimen even by those standards. His massive skull housed a brain that, while smaller than a human's, was remarkably sophisticated in its ability to process sensory information and adapt to new situations. He had learned over his 12 years of life that humans often represented opportunity rather than threat. Garbage cans, fish cleaning stations, and campsites had provided easy meals in the past, and his lack of natural fear of humans had been reinforced by numerous encounters where people had retreated rather than confronted him. The bear paused at the edge of the tree line, his small dark eyes scanning the chapel building. The structure was unfamiliar. He had not approached this area before, but the concentration of human scent and the promising food aromas made it worth investigating. His massive head swayed from side to side as he tested the air currents, analyzing the complex mixture of smells that reached his sensitive nostrils. Inside the chapel, Gregory continued his sermon, unaware of the massive predator that was now less than a football field's length away. "We gather here each week," he said, "not because this building offers us perfect safety from the storms outside, but because together we remember that our help comes from the Lord. We are a community bound not just by geography, but by faith, by the shared recognition that we need each other and we need God." The congregation listened with the attention of people who understood intimately what their pastor was describing. Island life had taught them all about interdependence, about the way that individual survival depended on community cooperation. They had seen neighbors risk their lives to rescue fishermen from disabled boats, had shared food during supply shortages, had cared for each other's children when parents were away on the mainland for medical care. Martha Cole glanced toward the kitchen, checking the coffee pot that was keeping warm on the small electric burner. She and Helen had arrived at the chapel at 7 that morning to begin preparations for the after-service fellowship time. The sisters took pride in their coffee, which they made strong enough to wake the dead, and in the variety of homemade treats they provided each week. This morning they had brought fresh-baked sourdough bread, wild blueberry muffins made from berries they had picked and frozen during the brief summer, and a coffee cake that filled the chapel with the warm scent of cinnamon and vanilla. The aroma of these baked goods, carried by the chapel's heating system and the natural air circulation of the building, was creating an invisible trail that extended well beyond the wooden walls. To human noses, the smell was pleasant but subtle. To Scar's extraordinarily sensitive olfactory system, it was like a beacon calling across the snowy landscape. The bear began to move again, his massive paws creating deep impressions in the snow as he approached the chapel. Each step was deliberate and careful, following techniques perfected over millions of years of evolution. Despite his enormous size, Scar moved with remarkable quiet, his broad paws distributing his weight in a way that minimized sound. The falling snow helped muffle any noise he did make, and the howling wind covered the subtle sounds of his approach. Gregory's voice rose slightly as he reached the climactic point of his sermon. The Apostle Paul tells us in Romans that we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Not that we will never face storms, not that we will never know cold or hunger or fear, but that in the midst of those trials we are not abandoned. Our help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth, who neither slumbers nor sleeps. Young Michael Mitchell looked up from his crayon drawing, his 4-year-old attention span finally exhausted by the adult words he didn't understand. He whispered to his mother, "Mama, when can we eat the cookies?" Rebecca smiled and put her finger to her lips, then whispered back, "Soon, sweetheart, when Pastor Gregory is finished talking." Dr. Kowalski shifted in his pew, his back aching from the uncomfortable wooden seat. At his age, he found it increasingly difficult to sit still for extended periods, and his mind had begun to wander to the medical supplies he needed to order for the clinic. The weather had delayed the last supply flight, and he was running low on several critical medications. He made a mental note to radio the dispatcher in Kodiak as soon as the storm passed. Outside, Scar had reached the chapel's foundation. The building sat on concrete piers that raised it about 3 feet off the ground, a necessary precaution against flooding and an aid to the structure's heating efficiency. The bear could smell the concentrated aromas of food and humans even more strongly now, and his excitement was growing. His breathing became slightly more rapid, and his movements took on the focused intensity of a predator who has located promising prey. The chapel's windows were positioned about 7 feet above ground level, too high for most animals to reach, but not beyond the capabilities of a massive bear who could rear up on his hind legs to a height of over 9 feet. Scar approached the nearest window on the building's north side, where the wind had blown snow into deep drifts against the chapel's wall. Inside, Gregory was beginning to conclude his sermon. "As we prepare to share communion together," he said, "let us remember that this simple meal of bread and wine connects us not only to Christ, but to each other. We are not isolated individuals, struggling alone against the wilderness. We are the body of Christ, and each of us has a part to play in our mutual care and protection." The pastor stepped down from the pulpit and moved toward the small table where the communion elements waited. This was always his favorite part of the service, the moment when theological abstractions became tangible reality in the form of bread and wine shared among people who truly depended on each other for survival. Scar had positioned himself beneath the north-facing window and was now rising onto his hind legs. His massive form, stretched to its full height, brought his head to within inches of the window glass. The bear's dark eyes peered into the warm, brightly lit interior of the chapel, taking in the scene of humans gathered together in their unfamiliar ritual. The sight that greeted the bear was unlike anything in his previous experience. The humans were not scattered and defensive as they usually were when he encountered them. Instead, they sat in orderly rows, their attention focused on a single individual who stood at the front of the group. More importantly, the bear could see the source of the food aromas that had drawn him here, a small kitchen area where prepared food waited on counters and warming plates. For several minutes, Scar remained at the window, studying the scene inside and working through the novel problem it presented. In his previous encounters with humans, he had relied on his size and intimidating presence to claim food sources or territory. But this situation was different. The humans were inside a structure that blocked his direct access to them and to the food he could smell so tantalizingly. The bear dropped back to all fours and began to circle the building, his keen intelligence assessing the structure for potential entry points. The chapel had been built to withstand severe weather, not to repel a determined 1,200-pound predator. The doors were solid wood, but hung on hinges that had never been tested against this kind of force. The windows were standard residential glass, adequate for keeping out wind and snow, but essentially useless against a massive bear's claws and strength. Gregory was beginning the communion liturgy when Scar completed his circuit of the building and returned to the front entrance. The chapel's main door faced south, partially protected from the worst of the wind by a small covered entryway that the congregation used to stomp snow off their boots before entering. The door itself was painted white, with small windows in its upper half, and it opened inward into the chapel's main aisle. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, Gregory intoned, following the familiar words of institution, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." The congregation prepared to come forward row by row to receive the communion elements. This was a weekly ritual that brought the small community together in a physical expression of their spiritual unity. Martha and Helen Cole would be first, followed by the Petrovs, then the Mitchell family, and so on until every person in the chapel had participated in the ancient rite. Scar positioned himself directly in front of the main door and reared up again on his hind legs. This time, instead of simply observing, he placed his massive front paws against the door and pushed. The door groaned under the pressure, but held firm. The bear increased the force of his push, and the hinges began to creak ominously. Inside the chapel, the sound was barely audible over the wind, but Kowalski's experienced ears caught it. He turned in his pew and looked toward the door, a small frown creasing his weathered face. "Did you hear that?" he whispered to his wife, but Margaret was focused on the communion service and merely shook her head. Gregory broke the communion bread and held it up for the congregation to see. "This is the body of Christ, broken for us and for our salvation." As he spoke these words, Scar dropped back to all fours and studied the door more carefully. The bear's problem-solving abilities were considerable, honed by years of accessing human food sources that required manipulation and adaptation. The bear noticed that the door opened inward, which meant that pushing against it was working against its natural movement. Instead, Scar began to paw at the door handle, his massive claws scraping against the metal knob. The sound was more pronounced now, a rhythmic scratching that several congregation members noticed. Viktor Petrov turned in his seat, his fisherman's instincts alert to any unusual sound that might indicate danger. Years of working on the ocean had taught him to pay attention to subtle changes in his environment, and something about the sound from the door raised his hackles. "Pastor," he called softly, "there is something at the door." Gregory paused in the communion liturgy and looked toward the entrance. As he did, the scratching sound intensified and the door began to rattle slightly in its frame. The congregation's attention was now divided between their pastor and the increasingly obvious disturbance at the chapel's main entrance. "It's probably just the wind," suggested Thomas Mitchell, though his voice carried more hope than conviction. The wind was certainly strong enough to rattle doors and windows, but this sound had a deliberate quality that didn't match the random gusts of the storm. Scar had discovered that by hooking his claws into the gap around the doorframe, he could pull as well as push. The bear's tremendous strength, combined with his leverage advantage, began to tell on the door's mounting hardware. The screws that held the hinges to the frame were not designed to resist this kind of lateral stress, and they began to work loose from the wood. The sound of splintering wood was unmistakable now, and the congregation began to show signs of real alarm. Several people stood up from their pews, and parents instinctively moved to gather their children closer. Dr. Kowalski reached for his medical bag, his mind already shifting into crisis mode, even though he wasn't sure what kind of crisis they might be facing. "Everyone please remain calm," Gregory said, his pastoral training taking over even as his own heart rate began to accelerate. "Victor, would you help me check the door?" The Russian fisherman nodded grimly and rose from his pew, his powerful frame moving with the careful precision of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. As the two men approached the chapel's entrance, Scar gave a tremendous pull on the doorframe. The upper hinge tore completely free from the wood, and the door sagged inward at an alarming angle. Through the growing gap, both men caught their first glimpse of the massive brown shape that was working to gain entry to their sanctuary. "Medved," Victor breathed, using the Russian word for bear. His face went pale as he took in the sheer size of the animal that was methodically destroying their door. "Pastor, this is very big bear. We must get people away from here." Gregory's mind raced as he processed this information. The chapel had no back exit, an oversight in the building's design that had never seemed important until this moment. The windows were too small and too high for most of the congregation to escape through, and even if they could, going outside into a blizzard while being pursued by a massive bear seemed like trading one death for another. "Everyone move to the back of the chapel," Gregory called, trying to keep his voice steady and authoritative. "Stay calm, but move away from the door now." The congregation began to respond, parents scooping up children and elderly members, helping each other navigate between the wooden pews. The orderly progression of the communion service dissolved into controlled chaos as 23 people tried to compress themselves into the small space at the rear of the sanctuary. Scar sensed the increased activity inside the building and redoubled his efforts. With one hinge completely destroyed and the other badly damaged, the door was now hanging at a crazy angle that left a gap wide enough for the bear to see inside. His dark eyes fixed on the movement of the humans, and his excitement reached a new level. The combination of food smells and the defensive behavior of potential prey triggered ancient hunting instincts that had been dormant during the bear's usual scavenging activities. Martha Cole, despite her 78 years, showed remarkable presence of mind in the crisis. She grabbed her sister Helen's hand and guided her toward the kitchen area, where a back window might provide an escape route for at least some of the congregation. "Helen, help me move the coffee pot," she said urgently. "We need to clear the counter if people are going to climb out the window." The Cole sisters began rapidly moving food and equipment away from the kitchen window, their movements quick and efficient despite their age. Behind them, Dr. Kowalski was helping organize the evacuation effort, his medical training having taught him the importance of triage and prioritization in crisis situations. "Children and elderly first," he called, "then we'll help everyone else." Thomas Mitchell was boosting his youngest son, Michael, toward the kitchen window when Scar finally succeeded in tearing the door completely free from its hinges. The heavy wooden barrier crashed inward with a sound like thunder, and suddenly the full bulk of the massive bear was visible in the doorway. Several women screamed, and young David Mitchell began to cry as he saw the enormous predator that had invaded their sanctuary. Scar paused for a moment in the doorway, his massive form nearly filling the entrance as he surveyed the scene inside. The bear's breath created clouds of vapor in the cold air, and his dark eyes reflected the chapel's interior lighting with an unsettling intelligence. For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, predator and prey studied each other across the length of the small sanctuary. Gregory stepped forward, placing himself between the bear and his congregation. His pastoral instincts overcame his terror as he faced the massive animal that had invaded his church. "Stay back," he called to his people, though his voice cracked slightly with the strain. "Everyone keep moving toward the window." The bear's attention fixed on Gregory, recognizing him as the alpha of this particular human group. In bear society, dominance challenges were settled through displays of strength and aggression, and Scar interpreted the pastor's protective stance as exactly such a challenge. The bear reared up on his hind legs, his full height bringing his massive head nearly to the chapel's ceiling. At over 9 feet tall and 1,200 pounds, Scar presented a sight that was both magnificent and absolutely terrifying. Several things happened simultaneously in the next few seconds. Victor Petrov, recognizing the bear's aggressive display, grabbed a wooden communion table and hefted it like a shield. Carl Anderson pushed his family toward the kitchen window while shouting instructions to his teenage son, Jake. Dr. Kowalski positioned himself to help lift people through the window while keeping one eye on the confrontation developing at the front of the chapel. And Gregory, despite every instinct screaming at him to run, held his ground and began speaking in what he hoped was a calm, authoritative voice. "Easy, big fellow," Gregory said, drawing on half-remembered advice about bear encounters. "We don't want any trouble here. Just back away slowly and we'll leave you alone." The words sounded absurd, even as he spoke them. It was the bear who had invaded their space, not the other way around, but he had to try something to buy time for his people to escape. Scar dropped back to all fours and began moving down the center aisle of the chapel, his massive paws making dull thuds on the wooden floor. His movement was deliberate and predatory, the slow stalk of a hunter who knows his prey has nowhere to run. The bear's small ears were forward and alert, and his nose worked constantly as he processed the complex mixture of scents that filled the building. Human fear, food, wood smoke, and dozens of other odors that told the story of this strange human gathering place. At the kitchen window, the evacuation was proceeding with desperate efficiency. Martha Cole had climbed onto the counter despite her age, and was helping to pass children through the narrow opening. Young Michael Mitchell had already been pushed through into the arms of his father, who had circled around outside to catch the evacuees. Helen Cole was next, her sister pushing her toward the window with surprising strength born of adrenaline and determination. "Move, move, move," Victor called softly, his accent thickening with stress as he kept one eye on the approaching bear while helping to organize the escape. The big Russian had positioned himself with the communion table between him and Scar, ready to use it as a weapon if necessary, though he harbored no illusions about his chances against a bear of this size. Gregory continued his slow retreat toward the back of the chapel, speaking continuously in what he hoped was a soothing tone. "That's right. We're just going to move back here slowly. Nobody needs to get hurt. You can have whatever food you want, just let us get out of your way." The pastor's seminary training had included exactly nothing about wildlife management, but his experience dealing with crisis situations in his ministry gave him some resources to draw upon. Scar paused at the communion table where the bread and wine waited, his sensitive nose investigating these new scents. The bear's massive head dipped toward the elements, and his long tongue emerged to taste the wine. The alcohol content was minimal, but the unfamiliar flavor seemed to interest the animal. With one casual swipe of his paw, Scar knocked the communion cup aside, sending wine splashing across the white altar cloth. The casual destruction of the sacred elements hit Gregory harder than he expected. This was his church, his sanctuary, the place where he had ministered to these people for 7 years. Seeing it invaded and desecrated by this massive predator triggered a surge of anger that momentarily overcame his fear. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the chapel with surprising authority. "This is God's house, and you have no place here." The bear's reaction was immediate and devastating. Scar's ears flattened against his massive skull, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. The sound was like distant thunder, a vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. Gregory's challenge had been interpreted as aggression, and the bear's predatory instincts fully engaged for the first time since entering the chapel. Behind Gregory, the evacuation continued with increased urgency. Dr. Kowalski had boosted Rebecca Mitchell through the kitchen window and was now helping Robert Haugen, the elderly Norwegian fisherman. The old man's arthritis made climbing difficult, but adrenaline and the sound of the bear's growl provided motivation that overcame his physical limitations. "Pastor, come back here now," Victor called, his voice tight with urgency. The Russian fisherman had seen brown bears before, though never one quite this large, and he recognized the signs of an animal preparing to attack. Scar's body language had shifted from curious investigation to active aggression, and Victor knew that Gregory was in mortal danger, but Gregory found himself unable to move. Part of it was simple terror. The sight of over half a ton of predator preparing to charge had triggered the psychological equivalent of a computer crash. But part of it was also his sense of responsibility as the shepherd of this flock. His people were still escaping through the kitchen window, and every second he could buy them might mean the difference between life and death for someone under his care. Scar began his charge with the explosive power that made brown bears one of the most dangerous predators in North America. Despite his enormous size, the bear could accelerate from a standing start to 30 miles per hour in just a few seconds, and the confined space of the chapel gave Gregory no room to maneuver. The pastor had perhaps 2 seconds to react before 1,200 pounds of muscle, bone, and claw would be upon him. Gregory threw himself sideways toward the pews, hoping to put some obstacle between himself and the charging bear. His dive was awkward and desperate, and he crashed into the wooden seats with bruising force. But the maneuver saved his life, at least temporarily. Scar's initial charge carried the bear past Gregory's original position, and the animal's momentum took him several steps further down the aisle before he could stop and turn around. Victor seized this momentary reprieve to act. The Russian fisherman hefted the wooden communion table and hurled it at the bear with all his considerable strength. The heavy table struck Scar in the shoulder and bounced off without causing significant damage, but the impact startled the bear and bought a few more precious seconds. "Get up, Pastor!" Victor shouted. "Move now!" Gregory struggled to his feet, his body aching from the impact with the pews, but his mind finally clear enough to function. He began running toward the back of the chapel, where the last few congregation members were being pushed through the kitchen window. Scar spun around with surprising agility for such a massive animal, and immediately began his second charge. This time, Gregory had a slight head start, but the narrow aisle between the pews limited his options for evasive action. The bear's claws scratched against the wooden floor as he built speed, and his heavy breathing had become a series of huffing grunts that spoke of a predator in full hunting mode. At the kitchen window, Carl Anderson was pushing his youngest daughter Lisa through the opening when he heard the sounds of the chase developing behind him. "Faster, sweetheart," he urged, though the 11-year-old was already moving as quickly as she could. Outside, Thomas Mitchell and several other men who had escaped earlier were catching people as they came through the window and helping them move away from the building. Gregory reached the back of the chapel just as Scar's massive paw swiped at his legs. The bear's claws, each as long as a man's finger and sharp as razors, missed Gregory's calf by inches, instead tearing through the fabric of his Sunday suit and gouging deep scratches in the wooden floor. The pastor threw himself toward the kitchen area where Viktor Petrov was waiting to help him reach the window. But Scar was not going to be denied his prey a second time. The bear lunged forward with the lightning-fast reflexes that made brown bears such efficient predators, and his massive jaws clamped down on Gregory's left leg, just below the knee. The pastor's scream of pain and terror echoed through the chapel as 18 4-inch canine teeth punched through muscle and bone with the force of a hydraulic press. The bear's bite force, measured at over 1,200 pounds per square inch, instantly shattered Gregory's tibia and fibula. But worse than the broken bones was the sawing motion that Scar began immediately, using his massive head to shake Gregory like a rag doll. This was the behavior pattern that made brown bear attacks so devastating. Not just the initial bite, but the violent thrashing that followed as the bear attempted to disable its prey. Gregory's screams brought an immediate response from the remaining people in the chapel. Viktor Petrov grabbed a metal folding chair and began beating the bear across the head and shoulders, shouting curses in Russian as he tried to force Scar to release his grip on the pastor. Martha Cole, despite her 78 years, grabbed a cast-iron frying pan from the kitchen and joined the attack, striking the bear's massive skull with blows that would have felled a normal animal. "Let him go, you bastard," shouted Carl Anderson, who had abandoned his position at the window to help in the fight. The maintenance supervisor grabbed a wooden stool and brought it down across Scar's back with enough force to splinter the wood. The bear barely seemed to notice the impact, his attention focused entirely on the prey clamped between his jaws. Dr. Kowalski forced himself to think medically, even as he witnessed the horrific attack unfolding before him. Gregory was losing blood rapidly from multiple puncture wounds, and the trauma to his leg was so severe that amputation might be necessary even if they could somehow get him to a hospital. But first, they had to get him away from the bear. Scar continued his savage shaking of Gregory's leg, the bear's massive head whipping back and forth with enough force to slam the pastor's body against the chapel's walls and floor. Gregory's screams had given way to a horrible gasping sound as shock began to set in, and his face had gone grey-white as his body struggled to cope with the massive trauma and blood loss. Helen Cole had found a container of cooking oil in the kitchen and poured it over the bear's head and face, hoping to blind or disorient the animal. The oil ran down into Scar's eyes and nose, causing him to release Gregory momentarily as he shook his massive head to clear his vision. Viktor immediately grabbed the pastor under the arms and began dragging him toward the kitchen window, leaving a trail of blood across the wooden floor. But Scar's release of Gregory proved to be only temporary. The bear's hunting instincts were fully engaged now, and the scent of blood had triggered a feeding response that would not be easily deterred. As Viktor struggled to lift Gregory's injured form toward the window, Scar charged again, this time aiming for the pastor's torso. The bear's massive jaws clamped down on Gregory's right shoulder and upper chest, crushing ribs and puncturing lung tissue with devastating efficiency. The pastor's body went limp as his nervous system began to shut down in response to the catastrophic trauma. Viktor found himself in the impossible position of trying to hold on to a man who was being savaged by over half a ton of predator. Maria Santos, the social worker who had been one of the last to reach the window, grabbed a large kitchen knife and joined the desperate fight to save Gregory's life. She stabbed repeatedly at the bear's neck and shoulder, trying to find some vital spot that might cause Scar to release his grip. The knife blade bent and broke against the bear's thick hide and dense muscle, but Maria continued her attack with the broken handle, tears of rage and helplessness streaming down her face. Outside the chapel, the evacuated congregation members could hear the sounds of battle coming from inside. Thomas Mitchell organized the men into a search party to look for weapons, axes, firearms, anything that might give them a chance against the massive bear. But the chapel was in an isolated area, and the nearest houses were hundreds of yards away through deep snow and bitter cold. Inside the chapel, Scar had begun the feeding behavior that marked the end of a successful hunt. Still gripping Gregory in his massive jaws, the bear began to drag the pastor's body toward the front of the church, away from the humans who were still trying to interfere with his kill. Gregory was unconscious now, his body in deep shock from blood loss and trauma, but his chest still rose and fell in shallow, irregular breaths. Victor made one last, desperate attempt to save his pastor's life. The Russian fisherman grabbed a heavy wooden beam that had been dislodged during Scar's initial entry and charged the bear like a medieval knight with a lance. He drove the beam into the bear's ribs with all his strength, and for a moment it seemed like the impact might dislodge Gregory from the animal's grip. But Scar's response was swift and decisive. The bear released Gregory and spun to face this new threat, his massive paw striking Victor in the chest with enough force to lift the 200-pound fisherman off his feet and slam him against the chapel's wall. Victor crumpled to the floor with several broken ribs and possible internal injuries. His heroic rescue attempt ended in failure. Dr. Kowalski immediately crawled to Victor's side while keeping one eye on the bear. The Russian was conscious but clearly in severe pain, his breathing shallow and labored in a way that suggested lung damage. "Don't move," the doctor whispered urgently. "Your ribs might have punctured something vital." With Victor down and Gregory motionless on the chapel floor, Scar returned his attention to his original prey. The bear gripped the pastor's body and began dragging him toward the front of the church, leaving a widening trail of blood on the wooden planks. Gregory's arms trailed behind him as Scar pulled his prize away from the remaining humans, who were now clustered at the back of the chapel in horrified silence. Martha Cole made one final attempt to save Gregory's life. The elderly woman grabbed a small fire extinguisher from the kitchen and discharged it directly into the bear's face and eyes. The cloud of chemical foam caused Scar to pause and shake his head, but the bear's grip on Gregory never loosened. After a few seconds, Scar simply resumed his methodical dragging of the pastor's body, ignoring the foam that covered his massive head. Outside, Thomas Mitchell had reached his house and retrieved his hunting rifle, a .30-06 that might actually have enough power to bring down a bear of Scar's size. But the chapel's windows were too small to provide a clear shot, and the risk of hitting one of the people still trapped inside was too great. Thomas and the other men could only watch helplessly as the sounds of the attack continued from within the building. Inside the chapel, Doctor. Kowalski was faced with an impossible decision. Gregory was clearly dying, probably already beyond saving, even with immediate surgical intervention. Victor needed urgent medical attention, but might survive if they could get him evacuated quickly. And there were still several people trapped in the chapel with an active predator who showed no signs of leaving voluntarily. "We have to get out of here now," the doctor said quietly to the remaining survivors. "There's nothing more we can do for Gregory, and if we stay, that bear might decide to attack someone else." The words felt like betrayal as he spoke them, but medical training had taught him the cruel mathematics of triage. Sometimes you had to abandon the dying to save the living. Martha and Helen Cole helped Doctor. Kowalski lifted Victor toward the kitchen window, though the injured fisherman's weight made the process difficult and dangerous. Every movement caused Victor to gasp in pain, and the doctor worried that rough handling might worsen his internal injuries. But staying in the chapel with Scar was certain death, while escape at least offered the possibility of survival. Maria Santos was the last to reach the window, her hands still covered with the bear's blood from her desperate knife attack. As she prepared to climb through the opening, she took one final look at the scene of carnage that had been St. Mary's Chapel just minutes earlier. Gregory's body lay motionless near the altar, surrounded by overturned pews and scattered communion elements. Scar crouched over his prey like a dark monument to the indifference of nature, his massive form seeming to fill the entire front of the church. The evacuation through the kitchen window took nearly 10 minutes, slowed by Victor's injuries and the difficulty of moving people through such a small opening in the midst of a blizzard. By the time the last survivor had been pulled to safety, Gregory had been motionless for several minutes, and there was no question that their pastor was dead. Outside, the evacuated congregation huddled together in the bitter cold, their Sunday clothes offering little protection against the Arctic wind and blowing snow. The temperature was 15 degrees below zero, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. Without proper winter gear, they could survive only minutes in these conditions, but returning to the chapel was impossible as long as Scar remained inside. Thomas Mitchell's house was the closest shelter, about 200 yards through the woods, but getting there would require moving several injured people across difficult terrain in life-threatening weather. Dr. Kowalski quickly assessed the injuries among the evacuees. Victor's chest trauma was the most serious, but several people had cuts and bruises from their desperate escape through the window, and everyone was showing early signs of hypothermia. "We have to move now," the doctor said, raising his voice to be heard over the wind. "Thomas, lead the way to your house. Carl, help me carry Victor. Everyone else stay together and move as fast as you can. If you fall behind, you could die out here." The procession through the snow was nightmarish. Victor drifted in and out of consciousness as he was carried between Dr. Kowalski and Carl Anderson, his breathing becoming more labored with each step. The elderly Cole sisters struggled through snow that was nearly waist-deep in places, supported by Maria Santos and Rebecca Mitchell. The children cried constantly, their small bodies losing heat rapidly to the bitter cold. Behind them, the chapel stood like a monument to violated sanctuary, its broken door hanging open and strange sounds emanating from within. Scar could be heard moving around inside the building, investigating the human scents and food sources that had originally attracted him. The bear showed no inclination to leave, having claimed the chapel as his temporary territory. Thomas Mitchell's house was a modest two-story structure built to withstand Arctic conditions, with thick insulation and a powerful heating system that had been running constantly during the 3-day blizzard. As the survivors stumbled through his front door, the warmth hit them like a physical blow, and several people collapsed immediately from exhaustion and shock. Dr. Kowalski went to work on Victor immediately, using supplies from his medical bag to stabilize the fisherman's breathing and treat his other injuries. The Russian had definitely suffered internal damage. His blood pressure was dropping and his pulse was weak and thready. Without surgery and a blood transfusion, Victor would probably die within hours. "We need to get him to a hospital," the doctor said grimly, "but there's no way to evacuate him in this weather. The airstrip is snowed in, and no helicopter could fly in these conditions." He paused, looking around at the other survivors who were watching him with desperate hope. "I'll do what I can with what I have here, but his injuries are beyond my ability to treat properly." Martha Cole had found Thomas's first aid kit and was treating the cuts and scrapes that several congregation members had suffered during their escape. Despite her own shock and grief over Gregory's death, the elderly woman moved with practiced efficiency, her lifetime of island living having taught her to function in crisis situations. Her sister Helen sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames, with the blank expression of someone whose mind was struggling to process what she had witnessed. The Mitchell children huddled together on the couch, wrapped in blankets that Rebecca had found in a closet. Young Michael kept asking where Pastor Gregory was. and why they had run away from church. His mother struggled to find words that would explain the morning's horror to a 4-year-old mind that had never encountered violence more serious than playground squabbles. Outside, the blizzard continued with undiminished fury. The wind howled around the house with a sound like banshees, and snow blew horizontally past the windows in sheets so thick that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. Weather conditions like this could last for days, trapping the survivors in Thomas's house while their pastor's killer claimed dominion over their destroyed sanctuary. Carl Anderson had found Thomas's radio equipment and was attempting to contact the authorities on Kodiak Island. The storm was causing severe interference with radio transmissions, but he managed to get through to the Coast Guard station briefly before losing the signal. His message was fragmentary but clear. There had been a fatal bear attack at the chapel. They had injured survivors who needed medical evacuation, and they were trapped by the weather. The Coast Guard dispatcher, Petty Officer Sarah Chen, received Carl's broken transmission at 11:42 a.m. and immediately began emergency protocols. Bear attacks were rare but not unknown in Alaska, and the service had procedures in place for exactly this type of situation. However, the weather conditions made immediate response impossible. No aircraft could fly in the current blizzard, and surface vessels would be useless for reaching an inland location. Chen contacted the Alaska State Troopers, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and the Emergency Medical Services in Kodiak. Within minutes, a coordinated response was being organized, but everyone involved understood that actual rescue efforts would have to wait until the weather improved. The survivors were on their own until the storm passed. At the chapel, Scar had finished his investigation of the building's interior and had begun feeding on Gregory's body. The bear's powerful jaws and teeth made quick work of clothing and flesh, and the sounds of his feeding carried through the broken door and across the snow-covered landscape. The chapel that had been a place of worship and community just hours earlier had become the scene of a predator's feast. Dr. Kowalski worked through the afternoon to keep Victor alive, using techniques he had learned during his residency in trauma surgery 30 years earlier. The fisherman's condition remained critical, but his vital signs had stabilized somewhat as the doctor treated his injuries with the limited supplies available. The greatest danger now was infection. Internal injuries were notoriously prone to contamination, and the doctor's sterile technique was compromised by the emergency conditions. As evening approached, the survivors began to organize themselves for what might be a lengthy stay at the Mitchell house. Thomas and Rebecca inventoried their food supplies, which were adequate for several days if carefully rationed. The house's heating system was functioning well, but the power grid on the island was vulnerable to storm damage, and they needed to prepare for the possibility of losing electricity. The psychological toll of the morning's events was becoming more apparent as the immediate shock began to wear off. Maria Santos, trained in crisis counseling, tried to help people process what they had experienced, but she was struggling with her own trauma from the attack. The image of Gregory being savaged by the massive bear played constantly in her mind, and she found it difficult to focus on helping others when her own mental state was so fragile. The Cole sisters prepared a simple meal from Thomas's pantry, their familiar routine of feeding others providing some comfort in the midst of chaos. But the normalcy of the domestic activity felt surreal after the morning's horror, and conversations died away into uncomfortable silence as people struggled with the disconnect between ordinary life and extraordinary trauma. Outside, the storm began to show signs of weakening as darkness fell. The wind was still strong, but the horizontal snow had given way to more typical vertical snowfall. Weather stations across the archipelago reported that the system was moving eastward and might pass completely by morning. For the first time since the attack, the survivors began to hope that rescue might be possible. At the Alaska State Trooper Post in Kodiak, Sergeant Mike Rasmussen was coordinating the response effort despite the weather constraints. Rasmussen had 23 years of experience in Alaska law enforcement and had investigated several bear attacks during his career, though none quite as dramatic as what was being reported from Uzinki. His immediate concerns were medical evacuation for the injured, securing the scene to prevent further attacks, and ultimately dealing with the bear that had killed Pastor Holloway. The Department of Fish and Game was represented by wildlife biologist Dr. Jennifer Park, who specialized in brown bear behavior and management. Dr. Park had been tracking the bear known as Scar for several years and was familiar with his behavioral patterns and territory. The attack on the chapel was completely outside the animal's normal behavior, and she suspected that the extended period without hibernation had created abnormal stress and hunger that might have triggered the aggressive encounter. Coast Guard helicopters were standing by at the Kodiak base, waiting for weather conditions to improve enough to allow flight. The rescue crews had dealt with emergency evacuations in severe weather before, but flying in Arctic blizzards pushed even military aircraft to their operational limits. The decision to launch would ultimately depend on whether the storm cleared enough to provide minimum visibility and wind conditions. As night fell over Uzinki, the survivors tried to settle in for what they knew would be a difficult evening. The adults took turns standing watch and monitoring Victor's condition, while the children were bedded down on couches and sleeping bags borrowed from Thomas's camping equipment. Despite their exhaustion, most people found it difficult to sleep, their minds replaying the morning's events in an endless loop of trauma and grief. At the chapel, Scar had completed his feeding and was exploring the building more thoroughly. The bear's enhanced senses detected interesting scents in the kitchen area, and he began investigating the cabinets and storage areas where the Cole sisters had kept their supplies. Canned goods were torn open with casual efficiency, and packages of flour and sugar were scattered across the floor as the bear searched for anything edible. The destruction of the chapel was methodical and complete. Scar's investigation left no area unexplored, and his massive size and strength reduced furniture and fixtures to splinters and debris. The communion table was overturned, the wooden cross from the wall was broken into pieces, and the pews were scattered like matchsticks. What had been a sanctuary was being transformed into a den, marked with the bear's scent and claimed as his territory. By midnight, Victor's condition had deteriorated despite Dr. Kowalski's efforts. The fisherman's breathing was increasingly labored, and his pulse had become irregular and weak. The doctor suspected internal bleeding that was beyond his ability to control without proper surgical facilities. He gathered the other survivors and explained the situation with brutal honesty. Victor was dying, and there was nothing more that could be done for him without immediate medical evacuation. Carl Anderson managed to establish another brief radio contact with the Coast Guard station, reporting Victor's critical condition and pleading for emergency evacuation regardless of weather conditions. The response was sympathetic but firm. No aircraft could fly in the current conditions, and attempting a rescue would only result in more casualties. They would launch as soon as it was humanly possible, but not before. At 3:17 a.m. on November 21st, Victor Petrov died quietly in Thomas Mitchell's living room, surrounded by the people he had tried to save. His last words, whispered to Dr. Kowalski in Russian, were a message for his wife Anya about their children and grandchildren. The fisherman, who had risked his life to fight a massive bear with nothing but a wooden table, passed away with the dignity and courage that had characterized his entire life. Dr. Kowalski closed Victor's eyes and said a brief prayer over the body, his medical training providing clinical detachment even as his heart broke for the loss of a good man. 2 members of the small congregation were now dead, killed by a predator that continued to occupy their church just a few hundred yards away. The survivors faced the prospect of dawn with grief, exhaustion, and the knowledge that their ordeal was far from over. The storm finally began to break as the first grey light of Arctic morning crept across Kodiak Island. The wind dropped to manageable levels, and the snow changed from a blinding blizzard to occasional flurries that danced in the still air. Weather stations reported improving visibility and conditions that might allow helicopter operations by mid-morning. At the Coast Guard base, rescue crews began their pre-flight preparations, even as weather observers continued to monitor conditions. The decision to launch would be made by the mission commander based on real-time weather data and the urgency of the medical situation. With 2 confirmed fatalities and possibly more injured survivors, the mission had maximum priority despite the operational risks. Dr. Jennifer Park from Fish and Game was preparing for her own deployment to Uzinki, bringing tranquilizer equipment and the expertise needed to deal with the bear that had caused the attack. Scar's behavioral patterns suggested that he might remain in the chapel area for several days, treating it as a temporary den while feeding on his kills. This presented both an opportunity and a danger. The bear would be locatable, but might defend his claimed territory aggressively against any humans who approached. The survivors at the Mitchell house heard the sound of helicopter rotors at 9:23 a.m., a mechanical rhythm that had never sounded so beautiful. Coast Guard Rescue 6505, a Jayhawk helicopter specially configured for Arctic operations, circled the area twice before landing in a clearing about 50 yards from the house. The downdraft from the rotors created a whirlwind of snow and debris, but the survivors didn't care about the temporary discomfort. Rescue had finally arrived. The helicopter crew worked with practiced efficiency to evacuate the injured and traumatized survivors. Victor's body was loaded first, followed by the elderly Cole sisters and the Mitchell children. The helicopter could carry only 6 people, plus crew on each flight, so 2 trips would be necessary to evacuate everyone from the island. Dr. Kowalski volunteered to stay with the second group, wanting to ensure that anyone showing signs of delayed shock or injury received proper medical attention. As the first helicopter lifted off for the flight to Kodiak Regional Hospital, the remaining survivors could hear sounds of activity from the direction of the chapel. Dr. Park had arrived with a state trooper and was setting up equipment to tranquilize Scar so that the building could be secured and Gregory's remains recovered. The operation would be dangerous. The bear had killed twice and would certainly defend his territory against human intrusion. The tranquilizing operation required careful preparation and perfect execution. Dr. Park's dart gun was loaded with enough sedative to drop a bear of Scar's size, but the animal would have several minutes between the dart's impact and unconsciousness, during which he would be extremely dangerous. The state trooper, Sergeant Bill Hayes, carried a .375 H&H rifle as backup, though killing Scar was considered a last resort, given his status as a protected species. The approach to the chapel was made with extreme caution. The building's broken door provided a clear view into the interior, where Scar could be seen lying near the altar in a position that suggested he was resting after feeding. The bear's massive form was clearly visible, and his relaxed posture indicated that he was not immediately alert to the approaching humans. Dr. Park took her shot from a distance of 30 yards, the tranquilizer dart striking Scar in the shoulder with a soft thump that was barely audible over the wind. The bear's reaction was immediate and explosive. He reared up to his full height with a roar that echoed across the landscape, his small eyes searching for the source of this new irritation. The dart hung from his shoulder like a bizarre decoration, its bright orange fletching visible against his dark fur. For several terrifying minutes, Scar remained upright and alert, swaying slightly as the sedative began to affect his nervous system, but still fully capable of devastating attack. Dr. Park and Sergeant Hayes retreated to a safe distance and waited, their weapons ready in case the bear decided to charge before the drugs took full effect. The sedative finally overwhelmed Scar's massive system at 11:47 a.m., and the bear collapsed near the chapel's altar with a ground-shaking thud that could be felt 50 yards away. Dr. Park waited an additional 10 minutes before approaching, using a long pole to prod the animal and ensure that he was completely unconscious. Only when she was certain that Scar was safely sedated did she signal for the recovery team to enter the chapel. The scene inside St. Mary's Chapel was one of complete devastation. Gregory's partially consumed body lay near the communion table, surrounded by torn clothing and pools of blood that had frozen in the cold air. The chapel's interior had been destroyed by Scar's investigation and territorial marking. Pews were overturned, walls were scarred with claw marks, and the scent of bear musk and death was overwhelming. The recovery of Gregory's remains required careful documentation for the investigation that would follow. Crime scene photographers captured every angle of the attack site, while the coroner performed a preliminary examination of the body. The pastor's injuries were so severe that formal identification would require dental records, but his clothing and personal effects left no doubt about his identity. Scar's unconscious form dominated the front of the chapel, his massive bulk seeming to fill the entire sanctuary. At over 1,200 pounds, moving the bear would require specialized equipment and techniques. Dr. Park administered additional sedative to ensure that Scar would remain unconscious during transport, then supervised the attachment of lifting straps that would allow a helicopter to carry the bear to a secure holding facility. The second Coast Guard helicopter arrived at 1:15 p.m. to evacuate the remaining survivors and transport Scar to the Alaska Zoo in Anchorage, where he would be held pending a decision about his fate. The bear's attack on humans, particularly in such an unusual setting, raised complex questions about wildlife management and public safety that would require careful consideration by state and federal authorities. At Kodiak Regional Hospital, the surviving congregation members were receiving medical and psychological treatment for their ordeal. The Cole sisters, despite their advanced age, had suffered only minor injuries and were expected to make full recoveries. The Mitchell family was dealing with trauma counseling for the children, who had witnessed violence that would haunt their memories for years to come. Maria Santos underwent surgery to treat cuts on her hands from her desperate knife attack on Scar, but her psychological injuries were considered more serious than her physical ones. The social worker who had dedicated her life to helping others cope with crisis was now struggling to process her own trauma from the chapel attack. Hospital psychiatrists began immediate therapy to prevent the development of severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Kowalski, despite his age and the stress of the ordeal, had emerged from the attack with no serious injuries. His medical training and experience had enabled him to function effectively during the crisis, but the loss of Gregory and Victor weighed heavily on his conscience. He blamed himself for not being able to save Victor's life, though everyone acknowledged that the fisherman's injuries had been beyond treatment under the circumstances. The investigation into the chapel attack was led by Alaska state troopers working in conjunction with federal wildlife authorities. The unusual nature of the incident, a bear attacking humans inside a building during a religious service, required careful analysis to determine what factors had contributed to Scar's aggressive behavior. Dr. Park's preliminary assessment focused on the bear's failure to hibernate on schedule and the resulting stress from inadequate food sources. Climate change had disrupted traditional salmon runs throughout the region, leaving many bears without the fat reserves needed for winter dormancy. Scar's desperation for food had apparently overcome his natural wariness of humans, leading to the fatal encounter at the chapel. The decision about Scar's fate would be made by a panel including representatives from Fish and Game, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Alaska Native organizations. Bears that killed humans were typically euthanized, but Scar's case was complicated by the environmental factors that had contributed to his behavior. Some argued that killing the bear would be punishing him for human-caused climate disruption, while others insisted that public safety required his destruction. Media coverage of the Chapel attack began within hours of the first rescue helicopter's arrival in Kodiak. The story had all the elements that attracted national attention: religious setting, isolated community, massive predator, heroic rescue attempts, and multiple fatalities. News crews from around the country began making arrangements to travel to Alaska for coverage of what was already being called the Chapel Bear attack. The small community of Uzinki found itself thrust into unwanted spotlight as reporters sought interviews with survivors and local officials. The islanders, accustomed to privacy and self-reliance, were overwhelmed by the sudden media attention and struggled to cope with the additional stress on top of their grief and trauma. Sarah Holloway learned of her husband's death through a phone call from Dr. Kowalski, who had reached her at their home in Anchorage, where she was visiting relatives for the holiday weekend. The pastor's wife collapsed upon hearing the news, her worst fears about island life finally realized in the most horrible way imaginable. Their daughter Emma, now a college freshman at the University of Alaska, was driving back from Fairbanks when state troopers intercepted her with the devastating news about her father. Funeral arrangements for Pastor Gregory Holloway and Victor Petrov would have to wait until their remains could be returned to their families and proper services planned. Gregory's body had been so severely damaged that burial would require a closed casket, while Victor's internal injuries had been compounded by the delay in medical treatment. Both families faced the additional burden of media attention during their time of grief. The destruction of St. Mary's Chapel represented more than just property damage to the community of Uzinki. The building had been the spiritual and social center of island life for nearly 80 years, the place where residents gathered not just for worship, but for community meetings, celebrations, and times of crisis. The physical rebuilding would be challenging enough, but restoring the sense of sanctuary and safety would be far more difficult. Insurance investigators arrived on Kodiak Island 3 days after the attack to assess the damage and begin processing claims. The chapel's policy covered storm damage and fire, but attacks by wild animals fell into a gray area that would require careful legal interpretation. The congregation faced the prospect of rebuilding without full insurance coverage, a daunting task for a community of limited financial resources. Dr. Jennifer Park continued her behavioral analysis of Scar during his detention at the Alaska Zoo. The bear showed no signs of rabies or other diseases that might have contributed to his aggressive behavior, confirming her initial assessment that hunger and stress had been the primary factors. Blood tests revealed that Scar had extremely low body fat levels, consistent with a bear who had been unable to feed adequately before winter. The zoo's veterinarians conducted a complete physical examination of Scar under continued sedation. Apart from the scars that gave him his nickname, the bear was in remarkably good health for an animal of his age and size. His teeth and claws showed normal wear patterns, and his muscle mass indicated an animal in prime physical condition despite his nutritional stress. Psychological evaluation of the attack survivors revealed a range of responses typical for trauma victims. The children showed signs of sleep disturbance and anxiety, but their young minds seemed better able to compartmentalize the experience than the adults. The elderly survivors, particularly the Cole sisters, drew upon decades of experience dealing with hardship and crisis, though they admitted that nothing in their long lives had prepared them for the horror of the Chapel attack. Thomas Mitchell returned to Uzinki a week after the attack to assess his property and begin the process of cleaning and repair. The house where the survivors had sheltered showed signs of the stress they had endured, bloodstains from Victor's injuries damaged furniture from the hasty medical treatment, and the lingering scent of fear and desperation. Mitchell found himself reluctant to enter certain rooms where the most traumatic conversations had taken place. The recovery of personal belongings from St. Mary's Chapel was a heartbreaking task that revealed the full extent of Scar's territorial claiming of the building. Bibles and hymnals were shredded beyond recognition, family photographs were destroyed, and personal items that had held deep spiritual significance were reduced to scattered debris. The communion elements that Gregory had been preparing when the attack began were mixed with bear scat and frozen blood. Wildlife biologists used the chapel attack as a case study for understanding the impacts of climate change on bear behavior. The disruption of natural feeding patterns and hibernation cycles was creating unpredictable encounters between humans and bears throughout Alaska. Traditional management approaches were proving inadequate for dealing with animals whose behavior was being altered by environmental factors beyond human control. The legal implications of the chapel attack extended beyond wildlife management to questions of premises, liability, and emergency response procedures. Attorneys representing the survivors' and victims' families began investigating whether the chapel's lack of emergency exits and security measures contributed to the severity of the incident. The isolated location and limited emergency services raised additional questions about government responsibilities for protecting rural communities. Congressional hearings on wildlife management and climate change impacts featured testimony from Dr. Park and other experts about the chapel attack. The incident was cited as evidence of the need for increased funding for wildlife research and emergency preparedness in rural Alaska. However, political divisions over climate change policy prevented any meaningful legislative response to the underlying environmental issues. The decision about Scar's fate was announced 6 weeks after the attack. Despite intense lobbying from animal rights groups who argued that the bear was a victim of human-caused environmental disruption, the panel voted unanimously to euthanize him. Public safety concerns and the precedent of previous bear attack cases were cited as determining factors in the decision. Scar was euthanized by lethal injection on January 8, 2026, ending the life of one of the largest brown bears ever captured in Alaska. His body was preserved for scientific study, providing researchers with valuable data about the physiology and genetics of Kodiak bears. Tissue samples were archived for future research into the impacts of environmental change on Arctic wildlife. The rebuilding of St. Mary's Chapel began in the spring of 2026, funded by insurance payments, denominational support, and donations from around the country. The new building incorporated security features that had been absent from the original structure, including multiple exits, reinforced doors, and communication equipment for emergency situations. However, many survivors questioned whether they would ever feel safe worshipping in a building that had been the site of such horror. Gregory Holloway's replacement as pastor of the Uzinki congregation was Dr. Michael Chen, an experienced minister with background in trauma counseling and wilderness ministry. Dr. Chen's first challenge was helping the survivors process their grief and trauma in a way that allowed them to rebuild their faith community. The new pastor acknowledged that some members might never return to regular worship, while others might need years of counseling to feel comfortable in a religious setting again. The psychological impact of the chapel attack extended far beyond the immediate survivors to affect the broader Kodiak Island community. Parents became reluctant to allow their children to participate in outdoor activities, and many residents reported increased anxiety about wildlife encounters. The sense of security that had allowed island residents to coexist with brown bears for generations was fundamentally altered by the violent breach of a sacred space. Tourism to Kodiak Island initially declined following the chapel attack, as visitors became concerned about bear safety despite the extreme rarity of such incidents. However, within 2 years, the attack had become part of the island's dark tourism appeal, with guided tours offering to show visitors the rebuilt chapel and discuss the events of November 20th, 2025. The commercialization of the tragedy was deeply offensive to survivors and victims' families. Viktor Petrov was posthumously awarded the Alaska Medal of Heroism for his actions in attempting to save Pastor Holloway's life. The Russian fisherman's courage in confronting a massive bear with improvised weapons was recognized as an extraordinary act of selflessness and bravery. His widow Anya accepted the award on behalf of their family, but privately expressed anger that her husband's heroism had been necessitated by what she saw as preventable circumstances. Martha and Helen Cole returned to Uzinki 6 months after the attack, driven by their deep roots in the community and their determination not to be driven away by fear. The elderly sisters resumed their roles as caregivers and community organizers, though friends noticed that they were more cautious about outdoor activities and showed signs of hypervigilance that had not been present before the attack. The Mitchell family relocated to Anchorage permanently, unable to overcome the trauma associated with their island home. Thomas Mitchell transferred to a maintenance position with the Alaska Department of Transportation, while Rebecca found work as a substitute teacher in the Anchorage School District. The children required extensive counseling to deal with nightmares and anxiety related to their chapel experience. Maria Santos left Alaska entirely, returning to California, where she resumed her social work career in an urban setting. The isolation and violence of the chapel attack had destroyed her ability to function effectively in a rural environment, and she found that the constant reminder of bears and wilderness triggered severe panic attacks. Her departure represented a significant loss for the island community, which had benefited greatly from her professional skills. Dr. James Kowalski continued his medical practice on Kodiak Island, but took early retirement 2 years after the chapel attack. The physician's inability to save Viktor Petrov had created lasting feelings of professional inadequacy, despite recognition that the fisherman's injuries had been beyond treatment under the circumstances. Kowalski's replacement was a younger doctor with emergency medicine training, better equipped to handle trauma cases in isolated settings. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game implemented new protocols for dealing with bears that failed to hibernate on schedule, including increased monitoring and proactive relocation of animals that showed signs of food stress. However, the underlying environmental factors that had contributed to SCAR's behavior continued to affect bear populations throughout the region, creating ongoing management challenges. Scientific studies of the chapel attack contributed to a broader understanding of human-bear conflict in changing Arctic environments. Research papers published in wildlife management journals cited the incident as evidence that traditional approaches to predator management were inadequate for dealing with climate-induced behavioral changes. The attack became a touchstone for discussions about conservation policy and human safety in an era of rapid environmental change. The rebuilt St. Mary's Chapel was dedicated on November 20th, 2027, exactly 2 years after the attack that had destroyed the original building. The dedication service was attended by many of the original survivors, though several found the experience too emotionally difficult and left before the ceremony was completed. Dr. Chen's dedicatory sermon focused on themes of resurrection and renewal, but acknowledged that some wounds might never fully heal. 5 years after the attack, Uzinki remained a changed community. The population had declined as several families relocated to the mainland, and the social cohesion that had characterized island life was strained by disagreements about bear management and safety protocols. The chapel attack had shattered the community's sense of security and highlighted their vulnerability in ways that would influence decision-making for generations to come. The families of Gregory Holloway and Victor Petrov established a memorial fund to support emergency preparedness training for rural Alaska communities. The fund provided grants for communication equipment, medical supplies, and training programs designed to improve survival rates during wildlife encounters. The memorial ensured that the deaths of the pastor and fishermen would contribute to preventing similar tragedies in the future. Legal settlements arising from the chapel attack were finalized in 2028, with payments totaling over $3 million distributed among survivors and victims' families. The largest settlement went to Sarah and Emma Holloway, compensating them for Gregory's wrongful death and the loss of his future earnings as a pastor. Victor Petrov's family received a substantial award recognizing his heroic actions and the financial impact of his death on his fishing operation. The legal proceedings had been complicated by questions of governmental liability for wildlife management and emergency response. Attorneys for the plaintiffs argued that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game had failed to adequately monitor Scar's behavior and relocate him before he became dangerous. State attorneys countered that bear attacks were an inherent risk of life in Alaska and that the unprecedented nature of the chapel incident made it impossible to predict or prevent. Insurance companies fought vigorously against claims related to the chapel destruction, arguing that bear attacks fell outside the scope of standard property coverage. The legal battle over the chapel's reconstruction costs lasted 3 years and required intervention by the Alaska Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled that the attack constituted a covered peril under the congregation's policy. The decision set important precedent for similar cases throughout the state. Emma Holloway used part of her settlement to establish the Gregory Holloway Wilderness Ministry Foundation, providing support for pastors serving in remote Alaska communities. The foundation funded safety training, communication equipment, and emergency medical supplies for rural churches, ensuring that other congregations would be better prepared for crisis situations. Emma's work gave purpose to her grief and honored her father's memory in a way that helped rather than exploited his death. Dr. Jennifer Park published a comprehensive study of the chapel attack in the Journal of Wildlife Management, providing detailed analysis of the environmental and behavioral factors that had contributed to Scar's aggression. Her research became required reading in wildlife biology programs across North America and influenced management policies for large predators in Arctic environments. The paper's impact extended far beyond Alaska, affecting bear management strategies in Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia. The chapel attack also prompted changes in building codes for religious structures in bear country. New regulations required multiple exits, reinforced doors, and communication systems for any church or community building serving rural areas with significant bear populations. The Holloway safety standards, as they became known, were initially controversial due to their cost and complexity, but were widely adopted after several near-miss incidents at other rural facilities. Anya Petrov remained on Kodiak Island for 2 years after her husband's death, struggling to maintain the fishing operation that had been their life's work. Without Victor's expertise and leadership, the business declined rapidly, and Anya was eventually forced to sell the boats and equipment at significant losses. She relocated to Seattle in 2027 to be closer to her grandchildren, but never fully recovered from the grief of losing both her husband and her homeland in the aftermath of the attack. The psychological impact of the chapel attack extended to first responders and medical personnel who had dealt with its aftermath. Several Coast Guard rescue personnel required counseling after witnessing the scene at the chapel, and the experience influenced their training protocols for future wildlife-related emergencies. The vivid trauma of discovering Gregory's remains and dealing with panicked survivors created lasting emotional scars among the professional responders. Carl Anderson became an advocate for improved emergency communication systems in rural Alaska, testifying before state and federal committees about the delays and difficulties experienced during the chapel crisis. His efforts contributed to increased funding for satellite communication networks and emergency beacon systems that could function in severe weather conditions. The Anderson Protocol for Rural Emergency Response was adopted by emergency services throughout Alaska. The Alaska Zoo's handling of Scar during his detention became a case study in wildlife crisis management. The facility's veterinary staff documented every aspect of the bear's behavior and physiology during his 6-week captivity, providing valuable data about stress responses in large predators. The information contributed to improved protocols for handling problem bears and influenced design standards for wildlife holding facilities. Thomas Mitchell's detailed weather records from the days preceding the chapel attack became crucial evidence in climate change research. His meteorological data helped scientists understand the relationship between unusual weather patterns and wildlife behavior disruptions. The information was incorporated into predictive models designed to anticipate future human-wildlife conflicts as Arctic climates continued to change. Religious communities throughout Alaska and northern Canada struggled with theological questions raised by the chapel attack. How could a loving God allow such violence to occur in a sacred space during worship? Seminary courses in pastoral theology began including modules on ministering in dangerous environments and helping congregations process trauma without losing faith. The theological implications of the attack continued to influence religious education for decades. The rebuilt chapel incorporated artistic elements commemorating the attack and its victims. A stained glass window depicted Gregory Holloway and Victor Petrov as martyrs, surrounded by imagery representing their sacrifice for others. The artistic treatment was controversial, with some community members feeling that it glorified violence, while others saw it as appropriate recognition of heroism. The window became a pilgrimage destination for Christians interested in wilderness ministry. Media coverage of the chapel attack influenced public perception of Alaska and its wildlife for years after the incident. Documentary films, magazine articles, and television specials repeatedly revisited the story, often sensationalizing the violence and portraying Alaska as a dangerous frontier where civilization provided little protection against nature's fury. Tourism officials struggled to counter these negative portrayals while acknowledging the legitimate safety concerns they raised. The attack's impact on Alaska Native communities was particularly complex, as traditional knowledge about bear behavior was suddenly questioned in light of Scar's unprecedented aggression. Tribal elders who had counseled coexistence with bears for generations found their wisdom challenged by younger community members who demanded more aggressive wildlife management policies. The incident created divisions within Native communities about the proper relationship between humans and the natural world. Scientific research into Scar's brain tissue revealed no abnormalities that might have explained his unusual behavior, confirming Dr. Park's assessment that environmental stress had been the primary factor. The bear's brain was remarkably similar to those of other Kodiak bears, suggesting that any animal of his species might have behaved similarly under the same circumstances. This finding was both reassuring and terrifying. It meant that the attack was not the result of a rogue animal, but it also suggested that similar incidents could occur again as environmental pressures increased. Educational programs in Alaska schools began including curricula about the Chapel attack as part of safety training for students. Children learned about bear behavior, emergency procedures, and the importance of environmental conservation in preventing human-wildlife conflicts. The attack became a teaching tool for multiple subjects, from biology and environmental science to social studies and ethics courses discussing human responsibility for wildlife management. The attack influenced federal policy regarding climate change adaptation in Arctic communities. Congressional hearings featured testimony from Chapel attack survivors and experts, leading to increased funding for research into climate impacts on wildlife behavior. However, political polarization over climate issues prevented comprehensive policy responses, leaving rural communities to develop their own adaptation strategies with limited federal support. International wildlife management organizations studied the Chapel attack as an example of how climate change was creating new challenges for human-wildlife coexistence. The incident was featured in United Nations reports on Arctic environmental changes and influenced international agreements on wildlife conservation. The global attention focused on Alaska's changing environment helped secure research funding, but also increased pressure on state officials to demonstrate effective management of wildlife conflicts. The long-term psychological impact on survivors varied significantly among individuals. Some, like the Cole sisters, demonstrated remarkable resilience and returned to relatively normal lives within a few years. Others, including several of the children who witnessed the attack, required ongoing therapy and struggled with anxiety and depression that affected their academic and social development. The differential impacts highlighted the importance of immediate and long-term mental health support for trauma survivors. Dr. Michael Chen's ministry at the rebuilt chapel focused heavily on healing and recovery themes, but he also had to address practical concerns about safety and emergency preparedness. Sunday services included regular drills for emergency evacuation, and the church maintained extensive first aid supplies and communication equipment. The balance between spiritual worship and practical safety created a unique ministry environment that influenced pastoral training programs throughout Alaska. The Chapel attack influenced wildlife photography and tourism practices throughout Alaska. Professional photographers and tour guides developed new protocols for bear encounters, emphasizing safety over getting dramatic shots. Several close-call incidents in the years following the attack were attributed to improved awareness and preparation among outdoor enthusiasts who had learned from the Chapel tragedy. Research into bear hibernation patterns revealed that Scar's failure to den was part of a broader trend affecting brown bears throughout Alaska. Climate change was disrupting traditional food sources and creating conditions that prevented normal hibernation behavior in increasing numbers of animals. The Chapel attack was recognized as an early warning of more frequent and severe human-bear conflicts that would require new management approaches. The economic impact of the Chapel attack on Uzinki extended beyond immediate costs to include long-term effects on property values, tourism, and community development. The island's reputation as a safe and peaceful community was permanently altered, affecting its ability to attract new residents and businesses. Economic recovery required years of effort to rebuild the community's image and restore confidence among potential visitors and investors. Memorial services for Gregory Holloway and Victor Petrov became annual events that drew visitors from around Alaska and beyond. The services combined religious observance with practical education about bear safety and environmental conservation. The memorial tradition helped transform the tragedy into a positive force for community building and public education, though some family members found the annual attention emotionally difficult. The Chapel attack influenced emergency medical services throughout rural Alaska, leading to improved training for wilderness trauma and enhanced capabilities for treating severe injuries in remote locations. Medical helicopters were equipped with better winter weather equipment, and emergency medical technicians received specialized training in dealing with wildlife attack injuries. These improvements saved lives in subsequent emergencies, creating a positive legacy from the tragic events. Wildlife rehabilitation programs in Alaska incorporated lessons learned from Scar's case, developing better protocols for identifying and managing bears showing signs of stress or abnormal behavior. Early intervention programs aimed to relocate problem bears before they became dangerous, though the effectiveness of these efforts was limited by funding constraints and the vast territory that needed to be monitored. The attack's influence on religious architecture extended beyond Alaska to other regions with significant wildlife populations. Churches in Montana, Wyoming, and Western Canada adopted similar safety modifications, and international missionary organizations developed new guidelines for constructing religious facilities in areas with large predators. The architectural changes represented a permanent shift in how religious communities approached the balance between accessibility and security. Academic studies of the chapel attack contributed to broader research into human psychological responses to wildlife encounters. Psychology journals published papers analyzing the different coping mechanisms displayed by survivors, and the incident became a case study in trauma psychology courses. The research helped develop better therapeutic approaches for treating victims of animal attacks and other nature-related traumas. The legal precedents set by the chapel attack cases influenced environmental law throughout the United States. Courts in other states cited the Alaska decisions when ruling on cases involving wildlife management, government liability, and insurance coverage for animal attacks. The legal legacy of the attack extended far beyond Alaska's borders, affecting how similar cases would be handled across the country. 10 years after the chapel attack, Uzinki had evolved into a different kind of community. The population remained smaller than before the attack, but those who stayed or moved to the island were generally more prepared for the realities of life in bear country. New residents underwent mandatory safety training, and the community maintained emergency supplies and communication equipment that exceeded requirements for settlements of similar size. The attack continued to influence scientific understanding of predator behavior and human-wildlife conflict, as researchers published follow-up studies tracking long-term changes in local bear populations. The data contributed to predictive models used to forecast future conflict zones and helped wildlife managers allocate resources more effectively. The scientific legacy of the tragedy provided valuable tools for preventing similar incidents in other locations. Sarah Holloway remarried in 2029, finding love again with a retired pastor who understood the unique challenges of wilderness ministry. Her new husband had experience with trauma counseling and helped her process the grief and anger that had dominated her life since Gregory's death. The remarriage was controversial within some religious communities, but Sarah found peace in building a new life while honoring her first husband's memory. The chapel attack's influence on popular culture included documentary films, true crime books, and even a dramatized television movie that took significant liberties with the actual events. The commercialization of the tragedy was painful for survivors and family members who had little legal recourse to prevent exploitation of their experiences. The media attention ensured that the attack remained in public consciousness, but often distorted the actual facts for dramatic effect. Educational institutions throughout Alaska incorporated the chapel attack into their emergency preparedness training, using the incident to teach students and staff about crisis response and wildlife safety. The attack became a standard case study in emergency management courses, helping train a new generation of professionals who would be better equipped to handle similar situations. The environmental factors that contributed to SCAR's aggressive behavior continued to affect bear populations throughout Alaska, leading to increased incidents of human-bear conflict in the years following the Chapel attack. While none reached the same level of violence or media attention, the overall pattern confirmed scientists' predictions that climate change would create ongoing challenges for wildlife management in Arctic regions. Research facilities studying Arctic wildlife behavior established permanent monitoring stations near Uzinki to track bear movement patterns and behavior changes in the area where the attack occurred. The data collected contributed to understanding how individual traumatic events affected both human and animal populations in specific geographic areas. The monitoring program became a model for similar research initiatives in other regions experiencing human-wildlife conflicts. The Chapel attack influenced federal funding priorities for rural emergency services, leading to increased support for communication systems, medical equipment, and training programs in isolated communities. The funding helped reduce response times and improve survival rates for various types of emergencies, creating a positive outcome from the tragedy that saved lives in situations completely unrelated to wildlife attacks. International conferences on human-wildlife conflict regularly featured presentations about the Chapel attack, ensuring that lessons learned from the incident influenced wildlife management policies around the world. The attack became a touchstone for discussions about balancing conservation goals with human safety concerns, and its influence extended to policy decisions in countries facing similar challenges with large predators. The psychological support systems developed for Chapel attack survivors became models for treating victims of other traumatic incidents involving wildlife. Mental health professionals developed specialized therapeutic approaches based on the experiences of the Uzinki survivors, and these techniques were applied to help victims of attacks by other predator species in different geographic regions. As climate change continued to affect Arctic ecosystems, the Chapel attack was increasingly viewed as an early warning of broader changes in human-wildlife relationships. The incident provided crucial baseline data for understanding how environmental disruption could lead to unprecedented animal behavior, and this information became essential for predicting and preparing for future challenges in a warming world. The rebuilt St. Mary's Chapel continued to serve the Uzinki community, though its congregation remained smaller than before the attack. Sunday services were well attended by those who remained on the island, and the church maintained its role as a community gathering place despite the tragic memories associated with the site. The survival and rebuilding of the congregation represented a victory of human resilience over the forces that had sought to destroy their spiritual community. 20 years after the Chapel attack, the incident remained a defining moment in Alaska's relationship with its wildlife. The attack had fundamentally changed how Alaskans thought about bear safety, emergency preparedness, and the balance between human settlement and wilderness preservation. The legacy of November 20th, 2025 continued to influence decisions and policies that affected thousands of people living in bear country throughout the Arctic regions of North America. The story of the Chapel attack became part of Alaska's oral tradition, passed down through families and communities as both a cautionary tale and a testament to human courage in the face of overwhelming danger. The heroism of Victor Petrov and Gregory Holloway was remembered alongside the tragedy of their deaths, ensuring that their sacrifice would inspire future generations to act bravely when others needed protection from forces beyond human control. The next stories, September 6, 2025, grizzly bear devours 2 hunters in Idaho forest. Within 12 minutes, the autumn mist clung to the dense canopy of lodgepole pines like a shroud, filtering the early morning sunlight into pale, ghostly beams that barely penetrated the forest floor of Idaho's Boise National Forest. At 5:47 a.m. on what would become one of the most horrific wildlife encounters in the state's recorded history, Franklin Frank Marcus Lewis, age 34, adjusted his orange hunting vest and checked his Remington 700 bolt-action rifle for the third time that morning. His younger brother, Adam Christopher Lewis, 29, knelt beside their makeshift camp near Trail Creek, approximately 18 miles northeast of the small mountain town of Lowman, Idaho, methodically loading rounds into his Winchester Model 70. Neither man could have imagined that in exactly 7 hours and 25 minutes, both would be dead, their bodies partially consumed by a massive grizzly bear that wildlife officials would later estimate at over 600 pounds. The Lewis brothers had arrived at their hunting camp 3 days earlier on September 3rd, driving Frank's modified 2019 Ford F-250 up the winding Forest Service Road 582 until the deteriorating gravel path forced them to park at mile marker 14.2 and hike the remaining 3.8 miles to their chosen campsite. Frank, a certified public accountant from Meridian, Idaho, had been planning this elk hunting expedition for 11 months, meticulously researching hunting units, studying topographical maps, and coordinating with the Idaho Fish and Game Department to secure their elk tags for Unit 32A. His military precision in planning reflected his 8 years of service as a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army's 1st Infantry Division, including 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he had earned a Bronze Star for valor during a Taliban ambush outside Kandahar in 2018. Adam, a diesel mechanic and volunteer firefighter from Nampa, Idaho, possessed an intimate knowledge of the wilderness that complemented his brother's tactical approach. Standing 6 feet 2 inches and weighing 185 pounds of lean muscle, developed through years of competitive rock climbing, Adam had been exploring Idaho's backcountry since he was 12 years old. His weathered Carhartt jacket bore patches from dozens of wilderness excursions, and his keen eye for animal sign had made him an invaluable hunting partner. Unlike Frank's methodical nature, Adam relied on intuition and an almost supernatural ability to read the forest's subtle communications. Their campsite, designated as Site 7 in Frank's detailed expedition notes, sat in a small meadow bordered by Trail Creek to the east and a steep granite outcropping to the west. The location offered strategic advantages: freshwater access, natural wind barriers, and elevated sightlines across the valley floor, where elk frequently traveled during their morning and evening migrations. Frank had selected this precise location using satellite imagery and topographical analysis, identifying game trails that converged near a natural salt lick approximately 800 yards south of their position. Dr. Sarah Michelle Hendricks, a wildlife biologist with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, would later describe the area as prime grizzly habitat during her testimony before the State Wildlife Board. The 43-year-old scientist, who held a PhD in wildlife ecology from the University of Montana, had spent the previous 4 years documenting increased grizzly bear activity in the Boise National Forest. Her research indicated that at least 12 individual bears, including 3 known breeding females, had established territories within a 15-mile radius of the Lewis brothers' campsite. Among these bears was a massive male she had designated as Bear 394, fitted with a GPS collar during a 2023 research capture. This particular animal, estimated at 625 pounds and standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, had demonstrated increasingly bold behavior around human activity, including 2 documented incidents of food cache raids at established campsites. The weather conditions during the brothers' first 3 days had been ideal for elk hunting. September in central Idaho typically brings cool mornings with temperatures in the low 40s, warming to comfortable mid-60s by afternoon. Light frost had painted the meadow grasses silver each morning. and the complete absence of wind created perfect stalking conditions. Frank's detailed weather log, later recovered from their campsite, recorded barometric pressure, wind direction, and precipitation with military precision. His final entry, made at 11:30 p.m. on September 5th, noted clear skies, light frost expected, optimal hunting conditions forecast for tomorrow. Lieutenant Colonel James Patrick Sullivan, retired, Frank's former commanding officer and longtime mentor, would later reflect on Frank's preparation and attention to detail during the memorial service held at Meridian's First Presbyterian Church. Frank approached everything in life with the same methodical precision he brought to military operations, Sullivan told the gathering of nearly 400 mourners. If there was a way to prepare for what happened to him and Adam, Frank would have found it. This was an act of nature that no amount of planning could have prevented. The morning of September 6th began like the previous three. Frank's internal alarm clock, calibrated by years of military discipline, woke him at 5:15 a.m. without need for his backup alarm. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and a thin layer of frost covered their two-man Eureka Timberline tent. Adam stirred as Frank quietly began their morning routine, starting with a small camp stove to heat water for instant coffee and oatmeal. The brothers had maintained noise discipline throughout their stay, communicating in whispers and hand signals to avoid alerting game to their presence. By 6:20 a.m., both men had consumed a quick breakfast and conducted final equipment checks. Frank carried his Remington 700 chambered in .30-06 Springfield, topped with a Leupold Viv-X 3.5 to 14 x 40 mm scope that he had personally zeroed at exactly 200 yards 3 weeks earlier at a shooting range in Boise. His ammunition consisted of 180-grain Nosler partition bullets, specifically chosen for their reliable expansion and deep penetration on large game. Adam preferred his Winchester Model 70 in .300 Winchester Magnum, fitted with a Vortex Viper PST 4 to 16 x 50 mm scope and loaded with 200-grain Swift A-frame bullets. Both rifles were capable of cleanly killing an elk at distances exceeding 400 yards. Their hunting strategy, developed through extensive scouting and aerial photography analysis, focused on intercepting elk as they move between feeding areas in the valley bottom and bedding sites on the mountain slopes. Frank had identified 3 primary intercept points along established game trails, each marked with GPS coordinates and detailed range cards. Their plan called for a 2-mile hike to Intercept Point Alpha, located on a ridge overlooking Miller Creek, where they would establish concealed positions before the elk began their typical dawn movement. At exactly 6:45 a.m., the brothers shouldered their packs and began the trek to their hunting position. Frank carried a 32-pound pack containing emergency supplies, field dressing equipment, and his spotting scope, while Adam's lighter 24-pound pack held additional ammunition, rope for game retrieval, and medical supplies. Their route followed an old logging road for the first half-mile before branching onto a game trail that climbed steadily through dense timber toward the ridgeline. The forest around them pulsed with life as they moved silently through the pre-dawn darkness. Frank's headlamp, fitted with a red filter to preserve night vision, cast eerie shadows among the pine trunks as they navigated around deadfall and rocky obstacles. Adam's superior knowledge of the terrain allowed him to anticipate terrain features and guide their movement with minimal use of artificial light. Neither man spoke during the hike, communicating through hand signals and subtle gestures developed during their many hunting expeditions together. At 7:32 a.m., they reached Intercept Point Alpha and began establishing their hunting positions. The location offered commanding views across the Miller Creek drainage, With clear shooting lanes extending to nearly 500 yards, Frank set up his spotting scope on a sturdy tripod while Adam used his binoculars to systematically scan the valley floor for elk movement. The morning mist had begun to lift, revealing patches of meadow grass and scattered aspen groves in brilliant autumn colors. Unknown to the Lewis brothers, they were being observed. Bear 394, the massive male grizzly that Dr. Hendricks had been tracking, had detected their scent during their approach to the ridge. The bear's exceptional olfactory system, capable of detecting odors at distances exceeding 2 miles, had been monitoring human activity in the area for the past 3 days. Unlike black bears, which typically avoid human contact, this particular grizzly had learned to associate humans with potential food sources, following several encounters with improperly secured campsites. Dr. Marcus Anthony Rodriguez, a bear behavior specialist with the U.S. Geological Survey's Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, later analyzed GPS data from Bear 394's collar to reconstruct the animal's movements during the critical period. His analysis revealed that the bear had been shadowing the brothers from a distance of approximately 200 yards since they left their campsite, using terrain features and wind direction to remain undetected. This stalking behavior, while rare, indicated an extremely dangerous level of habituation and predatory interest. At 8:15 a.m., Adam spotted the first elk of the morning, a small herd of 6 cows and 2 calves moving along the creek bottom, approximately 400 yards below their position. Frank immediately began studying the animals through his spotting scope, noting their movement pattern and estimating their probable destination. Both brothers hoped that a mature bull might be trailing the herd, as bulls often followed at a distance during the early stages of the rut. Their patience was rewarded at 8:43 a.m. when Adam detected movement in a patch of willows near the creek. A massive bull elk, carrying what Frank estimated as a 6-point antler, spread exceeding 350 inches, emerged from cover and began following the cowherd's trail. The animal represented exactly the type of trophy they had traveled so far to hunt, and Frank immediately began calculating range and wind drift for a potential shot. The bull's behavior, however, seemed agitated and nervous. Rather than the confident stride typical of a dominant herd bull, this animal displayed constant vigilance, frequently stopping to test the air and scan its surroundings. Adam noticed the elk's stress behavior and whispered to Frank, "Something's got him spooked. He's acting like something's hunting him." Dr. Hendricks would later explain that elk and other ungulates possess an acute awareness of predator presence, often detecting bears long before humans notice any sign of danger. The bull elk's nervous behavior should have served as a warning to the hunters that a major predator was active in the immediate area. Unfortunately, focused on their hunting opportunity, neither brother recognized the significance of the elk's agitation. At 9:07 a.m., the bull elk suddenly bolted from the willows and disappeared into heavy timber, followed immediately by the remainder of the herd. Frank cursed quietly at the lost opportunity, while Adam continued scanning with his binoculars, trying to determine what had caused the animals to flee. Neither hunter detected any obvious cause for the elk's departure, attributing their flight to natural wariness or possibly human scent carried by shifting wind currents. The next 2 hours passed slowly as the brothers maintained their vigil from the ridge. Frank documented sightings of various wildlife in a small notebook, recording times, species, and behavior patterns with characteristic precision. His entries included 3 mule deer, a family group of blue grouse, and numerous songbirds. Adam dozed intermittently against a large pine tree, conserving energy for what might become a long day of hunting. At 11:20 a.m., Adam suggested they relocate to Intercept Point Bravo, positioned on the opposite side of the drainage where they might intercept elk moving to midday bedding areas. Frank agreed with the tactical reasoning, and both men began packing their equipment for the move. This decision, made based on sound hunting logic, would inadvertently position them in the exact location where their lives would end in less than 2 hours. Intercept Point Bravo sat in a saddle between two ridges, offering concealment and multiple shooting opportunities, but also creating a natural funnel that restricted escape routes. The position overlooked a series of meadows connected by heavily used game trails, making it an ideal ambush location for both hunters and predators. Frank's tactical analysis had correctly identified the area's strategic advantages, but had failed to consider its potential dangers. The relocation required a challenging 1-hour hike that descended nearly 800 feet into the creek bottom before climbing steeply to the opposite ridge. Both brothers were in excellent physical condition, but the altitude and heavy packs made the trek demanding. They maintained noise discipline throughout the movement, pausing frequently to glance ahead and listen for elk activity. During their descent into the drainage, they passed within 150 yards of Bear 394's position without detecting the animal's presence. The grizzly, demonstrating remarkable stealth for such a massive creature, had positioned itself downwind behind a dense stand of lodgepole pines. Dr. Rodriguez's later analysis of the GPS data showed that the bear had anticipated the brothers' movement and had positioned itself along their probable route, indicating an alarming level of tactical awareness. At 12:25 p.m., Frank and Adam reached Intercept Point Bravo and began establishing their second hunting position of the day. The location offered excellent visibility across 3 separate meadows, with shooting lanes extending to nearly 600 yards. Frank set up his spotting scope, while Adam used his rifle scope to systematically examine potential elk hiding spots in the timber. Neither brother noticed the large pile of bear scat, less than 48 hours old, located just 30 yards from their chosen position. The scat contained elk hair and bone fragments, indicating recent predation by a large carnivore. Dr. Hendricks later identified the scat as definitely originating from Bear 394 based on its size and DNA analysis. The presence of this sign should have immediately alerted experienced outdoorsmen to the danger of remaining in the area. At 1:15 p.m., their vigilance was rewarded with the sighting of a lone cow elk, feeding in the largest meadow approximately 300 yards below their position. Frank studied the animal through his spotting scope, while Adam maintained a broader watch for additional elk or the presence of a herd bull. The cow appeared relaxed and undisturbed, methodically feeding on late-season grass and occasionally lifting her head to scan for danger. The brothers' focus on the cow elk prevented them from noticing subtle changes in the forest around them. Birds had stopped singing, and the normal rustling sounds of small mammals had ceased entirely. These warning signs, recognized by indigenous hunters for thousands of years, indicated the presence of a major predator in the immediate vicinity. At 1:47 p.m., the cow elk in the meadow suddenly raised her head and stared directly toward the brothers' position. Her body language indicated extreme alertness, with ears pointed forward and muscles tensed for flight. Adam lowered his binoculars and whispered to Frank, "She's looking right at us. Think she's spotted us?" Frank adjusted his spotting scope to examine the elk more closely and noticed something that made his blood run cold. The cow wasn't looking at their position on the ridge. She was staring at something much closer to her location in the meadow. Frank shifted his scope's field of view and immediately spotted the massive grizzly bear approaching the elk from downwind, moving with the fluid grace of a natural predator despite its enormous size. "Jesus Christ, Adam," Frank whispered urgently. "There's a huge grizzly down there stalking that elk. Get your rifle ready." Adam immediately swung his Winchester toward the meadow and located the bear through his rifle scope. The animal was magnificent and terrifying, with dark brown fur tipped with silver and a distinctive shoulder hump that marked it as a mature boar grizzly. The bear's head appeared disproportionately large, even for its massive body, and its powerful forearms rippled with muscle as it moved through the grass. Both brothers watched in fascination and growing concern as the predator-prey drama unfolded below them. The bear moved with surprising stealth, using terrain features and vegetation to mask its approach, while the elk remained frozen in place, apparently paralyzed by fear or indecision. The cow's survival instincts were clearly screaming warnings, but the bear's positioning had effectively blocked her most advantageous escape routes. At 1:52 p.m., the grizzly's stalk ended in explosive violence. The bear charged the final 30 yards to the elk in approximately 3 seconds, reaching speeds that Dr. Rodriguez later estimated at nearly 35 miles per hour. The cow attempted to flee, but stumbled in the soft meadow soil, allowing the bear to close the distance and deliver a devastating blow with its massive paw. The elk's neck snapped audibly, and the animal collapsed instantly, killed by the tremendous force of the bear's attack. Frank and Adam watched in stunned silence as the grizzly immediately began feeding on its kill, using powerful jaws equipped with 2-inch canine teeth to tear through hide and muscle. The bear's feeding behavior was methodical and efficient, clearly that of an experienced predator accustomed to killing large prey. Neither brother had ever witnessed such raw, predatory power, and both felt a profound shift in their understanding of their position in the wilderness food chain. "We need to get out of here," Adam whispered, his voice barely audible. "That thing is massive, and we're too close." Frank agreed with his brother's assessment, recognizing that their hunting expedition had suddenly become a potentially life-threatening situation. Both men began slowly backing away from their observation position, moving with extreme care to avoid creating any sound or movement that might attract the bear's attention. Their military and emergency response training had taught them that tactical withdrawal was often the wisest course of action when facing overwhelming odds. Unfortunately, their movement came too late. Bear 394's exceptional hearing had already detected the soft scraping sound of Frank's spotting scope tripod being adjusted on the rocky ground. The bear immediately lifted its massive head from the elk carcass and began searching for the source of the unfamiliar sound. Bears possess hearing capabilities far superior to humans, capable of detecting sounds at frequencies and distances that would be completely missed by even trained outdoorsmen. Dr. Rodriguez later explained that bears feeding on fresh kills enter an extremely heightened state of awareness, becoming hypervigilant to any potential threat that might attempt to steal their prize. This protective behavior, combined with the massive adrenaline surge from the recent kill, creates a potentially explosive situation when humans are detected in the vicinity. The bear's natural response is to eliminate any perceived threat to its food source, regardless of the threat's actual intentions. At 1:58 p.m., Bear 394 abandoned its kill and began moving directly toward the brothers' position on the ridge. The animal's approach was deliberate and purposeful, demonstrating none of the hesitant or curious behavior typically associated with human-bear encounters. Instead, the grizzly moved with the confidence of a predator that had already made the decision to attack, covering the steep terrain with surprising speed and agility. Frank spotted the bear's approach first and immediately grabbed Adam's shoulder, pointing toward the ascending grizzly while reaching for his rifle. Both brothers recognized the extreme danger of their situation, but made the critical error of remaining in their current position rather than attempting immediate evacuation. Their combined hunting experience suggested that bears typically avoided confrontation with humans, leading them to believe that aggressive displays or warning shots might discourage the animal's approach. "Get your rifle ready," Frank hissed, chambering a round in his Remington, while Adam did the same with his Winchester. Both men had extensive experience with firearms and had practiced shooting at various ranges and angles, but neither had ever faced the prospect of shooting a charging grizzly bear in a life-or-death situation. The psychological pressure of such an encounter, combined with the bear's surprising speed and the steep, uneven terrain, would severely test their marksmanship skills. The bear's ascent of the 200-yard slope took approximately 90 seconds, during which both brothers had multiple opportunities to shoot. However, the combination of dense vegetation, the bear's erratic movement pattern, and their own escalating panic prevented either man from achieving a clear shot. Frank later admitted in his final radio transmission that he had lost sight of the bear multiple times during its approach, making accurate fire impossible. At 2:01 p.m., Bear 394 reached a position approximately 50 yards from the brothers' location and paused behind a large boulder, apparently assessing the situation and planning its final approach. This brief pause provided Frank and Adam with their best opportunity to either retreat or engage the animal with firearms. But the bear's partial concealment and the brothers' deteriorating psychological state prevented effective action. Dr. Jennifer Lynn Martinez, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma responses, later analyzed the brothers' behavior during this critical period and identified several factors that impaired their decision-making abilities. The sudden transformation from routine hunting activity to life-threatening crisis triggered acute stress responses that significantly reduced cognitive function and motor skills. Additionally, the overwhelming nature of facing such a large and powerful predator likely induced a form of psychological paralysis that prevented rational, tactical thinking. People often ask why experienced outdoorsmen like the Lewis brothers didn't simply shoot the bear, Doctor. Martinez explained during a wilderness safety seminar held 6 months after the attack. The reality is that the human brain's response to extreme, unprecedented threats can severely impair even highly trained individuals' ability to perform complex tasks like accurate marksmanship under pressure. At 2:02 p.m., the bear emerged from behind the boulder and resumed its approach, now moving at a faster pace that clearly indicated aggressive intent. The animal's body language had shifted from cautious investigation to unmistakable predatory behavior, with its head lowered, ears pinned back, and muscles coiled for explosive action. Both brothers finally recognized that they were facing an imminent attack and attempted to coordinate their defensive response. Frank's military training kicked in as he tried to establish fields of fire and coordinate with Adam to maximize their defensive capabilities. "You take the left side, I'll cover right," he commanded, falling back on infantry tactics learned during his combat deployments. However, the tactics developed for human adversaries proved inadequate when facing a 600-pound predator capable of covering ground at remarkable speed. Adam, drawing on his firefighter training for high-stress emergency situations, attempted to remain calm and focus on shot placement rather than rapid fire. His experience fighting structure fires had taught him that panic led to mistakes, and mistakes in dangerous situations led to casualties. However, the psychological pressure of facing a charging grizzly bear exceeded anything he had encountered in his emergency response career. At exactly 2:03 p.m., Bear 394 launched its final charge from a distance of approximately 30 yards. The bear's acceleration was explosive, covering the remaining ground in less than 4 seconds while presenting an extremely difficult target for the brothers' rifles. Frank managed to fire one shot that struck the bear in the shoulder, but failed to penetrate deeply enough to reach vital organs. The 180-grain bullet, while capable of killing elk cleanly, proved insufficient against the bear's massive bone structure and thick muscle mass. Adam's shot, fired approximately 1 second after Frank's, missed entirely as the bear's rapid movement and his own deteriorating composure combined to throw off his aim. The 200-grain bullet struck the ground 3 feet behind the charging animal, sending up a spray of dirt and rock fragments, but causing no damage to the bear. The miss eliminated Adam's opportunity for a follow-up shot, as the bear closed the final distance between them. The grizzly's attack began at 2:03:17 p.m. when it collided with Frank, who had been positioned slightly ahead of his brother while attempting to acquire a clear shot. The bear's 600-pound mass, moving at approximately 25 miles per hour, generated tremendous kinetic energy that instantly knocked Frank unconscious and sent his rifle flying nearly 20 feet through the air. The initial impact likely caused severe internal injuries, including multiple rib fractures and possible organ damage. Adam had approximately 2 seconds to react, as the bear mauled his brother before turning its attention to him. His firefighter training had prepared him for rapid decision-making under extreme pressure, and he briefly considered attempting to retreat down the steep slope behind their position. However, the bear's incredible speed and agility made escape impossible, and Adam made the courageous decision to attempt to defend his unconscious brother rather than abandon him. Using his rifle as a club, Adam struck the bear twice across the head and shoulders, producing solid impacts that would have seriously injured or killed a human attacker. However, the grizzly's massive skull and powerful neck muscles absorbed the blows with minimal effect. The bear paused its attack on Frank long enough to focus its attention on Adam, recognizing him as the more immediate threat. At 2:03:45 p.m., Bear 394 struck Adam with its right paw, delivering a blow that Dr. Patricia Ann Williams, the forensic pathologist who later performed the brothers' autopsies, described as equivalent to being hit by a sledgehammer wielded by someone with superhuman strength. The impact broke Adam's left arm in 3 places and sent him tumbling down the rocky slope, his rifle lost somewhere in the dense vegetation. The bear followed Adam's fall, reaching him before he could regain his footing or attempt to locate a weapon. The animal's second attack was more systematic and brutal, using its powerful jaws to inflict massive trauma while its claws raked across Adam's torso and limbs. Adam's screams, later reported by campers nearly 2 miles away, echoed across the valley for approximately 30 seconds before being silenced permanently. Dr. Williams's autopsy report indicated that Adam survived the initial mauling for several minutes, during which time the bear began feeding behavior typically associated with predation rather than defensive attacks. This feeding behavior, combined with the bear's earlier stalking patterns, suggested that Bear 394 had viewed the brothers as prey rather than threats from the beginning of the encounter. Frank regained consciousness at approximately 2:06 p.m. to find himself severely injured and barely able to move. The bear had returned to his position after killing Adam and was beginning to drag his body toward a more secluded feeding location. Frank's military training and survival instincts overcame his injuries long enough for him to retrieve his emergency satellite communicator and activate an emergency beacon. The device, a Garmin InReach Explorer Plus, transmitted Frank's GPS coordinates and emergency status to the Regional Emergency Coordination Center in Boise at 2:07:23 p.m. However, the unit's text messaging capability had been damaged during the bear attack, preventing Frank from providing specific details about the nature of their emergency. The emergency beacon indicated only that 2 hunters required immediate medical evacuation, not that they were under active attack by a large predator. Frank's final transmission, sent at 2:08:41 p.m., consisted of 3 words typed with tremendous difficulty using his uninjured hand: "Bear attacking us." The message was received by emergency dispatchers, but the delay in transmission meant that additional details could not be requested before Frank lost consciousness for the final time. Bear 394's feeding behavior continued for approximately 8 more minutes, during which time the animal consumed portions of both brothers while remaining alert to potential threats. The bear's actions demonstrated the methodical efficiency of an experienced predator, suggesting that this was not the animal's first human kill. Dr. Rodriguez's subsequent investigation revealed evidence of at least 2 other human encounters involving this particular bear, both of which had been attributed to missing hiker cases due to lack of direct evidence. At 2:17 p.m., the bear was disturbed by the sound of an approaching aircraft and abandoned its feeding to retreat into heavy timber. The animal's departure likely prevented complete consumption of the brothers' remains, allowing for later identification and forensic analysis. However, the damage inflicted during the brief feeding period was extensive enough to cause immediate death in both victims. The aircraft responsible for interrupting the bear's feeding was an Idaho Army National Guard UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter dispatched from Gowan Field in Boise, following receipt of Frank's emergency beacon signal. The helicopter, designated as Dustoff 77, was crewed by Major Rebecca Ann Thompson, pilot, Captain Michael James Rodriguez, co-pilot, Staff Sergeant David Paul Harrison, crew chief, and Specialist Emma Catherine Davis, medic. Their rapid response time of just under 90 minutes from initial alert to arrival on scene was considered exceptional, given the remote location and challenging weather conditions that had developed during the afternoon. Major Thompson, a decorated combat veteran with over 3,000 flight hours, including multiple deployments to Afghanistan, immediately recognized the scene's horrific nature upon arrival at the coordinates provided by Frank's emergency beacon. Her initial radio transmission back to the Regional Emergency Coordination Center at 3:47 p.m. was brief and professional. Dustoff 77 has located the emergency beacon. We have 2 confirmed fatalities, apparent large animal attack. Requesting immediate support from Idaho Fish and Game and County Coroner. Scene is not secure. The helicopter's crew established a landing zone approximately 200 yards from the attack site, maintaining safe distance from the suspected predator while allowing for rapid deployment of personnel and equipment. Specialist Davis, a combat medic with extensive trauma care experience, conducted the initial assessment of both victims and confirmed that no life-saving measures were possible. Her medical training, however, had not prepared her for the extensive damage caused by a large predator, and she would later require psychological counseling to process the traumatic images. Captain Rodriguez immediately established radio communications with multiple agencies, including the Valley County Sheriff's Department, Idaho Fish and Game Enforcement Division, and the U.S. Forest Service. His professional demeanor and clear reporting helped coordinate the complex multi-agency response that would be required to secure the scene, investigate the attack, and safely recover the brothers' remains. Staff Sergeant Harrison, responsible for crew security and equipment management, maintained continuous surveillance of the surrounding area while his crewmates worked at the scene. His infantry background and combat experience had taught him to expect secondary attacks in hostile environments, and he remained constantly alert for the bear's potential return. Harrison's vigilance proved justified when he spotted movement in the tree line approximately 300 yards from the landing zone at 4:15 p.m. The movement Harrison detected was indeed Bear 394, which had been observing the helicopter and its crew from concealment among the lodgepole pines. The animal's bold behavior in remaining near the attack site, despite the presence of humans and machinery, indicated an extremely dangerous level of aggression and lack of natural fear. Most bears would have fled the area immediately upon hearing the helicopter's approach, but this particular animal appeared to be defending its kill site. Dr. Hendricks arrived on scene at 5:23 p.m. via a second helicopter, accompanied by Idaho Fish and Game Enforcement Officer Lieutenant Colonel James Michael O'Brien and 2 additional wildlife specialists. Dr. Hendricks immediately began documenting the attack site using photography, GPS mapping, and evidence collection techniques developed for wildlife attack investigations. Her preliminary assessment confirmed that the attack showed clear predatory behavior rather than defensive actions by a surprised or threatened bear. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien, a 22-year veteran of wildlife law enforcement with extensive experience in dangerous animal encounters, took charge of scene security and began coordinating the hunt for Bear 394. His initial priority was ensuring the safety of all personnel at the scene, followed by evidence preservation and planning for the bear's location and elimination. O'Brien's experience had taught him that bears involved in human fatalities almost invariably had to be destroyed, as they typically developed predatory associations with humans that made them too dangerous to relocate. The Valley County Sheriff's Department was represented by Sheriff Patricia Lynn McDonald and Deputy Coroner Dr. Anthony James Mitchell, both arriving on scene at 6:41 p.m. aboard a third helicopter. Sheriff McDonald, serving her second term as the county's chief law enforcement officer, had investigated numerous wilderness fatalities during her career, but had never encountered a double homicide by wildlife. Her professional composure was tested by the extensive damage to the victims and the continuing threat posed by an aggressive predator still active in the area. Dr. Mitchell, a forensic pathologist with the Idaho State Police Crime Laboratory, began his preliminary examination of the brothers' remains at 7:05 p.m. under portable floodlights powered by the helicopter's generators. His initial assessment indicated that both victims had died from massive trauma consistent with large predator attacks, but the extent of feeding damage would require extensive laboratory analysis to determine exact causes of death. Dr. Mitchell's experience with animal attacks was limited, necessitating consultation with wildlife forensic specialists from other states. The recovery operation required extreme caution due to the continuing presence of Bear 394 in the immediate area. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien established a security perimeter using armed personnel positioned at key observation points while the coroner's team worked to carefully document and remove the brothers' remains. The operation was complicated by deteriorating weather conditions as an afternoon thunderstorm system moved across the area, bringing heavy rain and gusty winds that made helicopter operations increasingly dangerous. At 8:32 p.m., during a brief clearing in the weather, Bear 394 was spotted by Idaho Fish and Game Wildlife Specialist Dr. Marcus James Chen, who was positioned in an observation post approximately 400 yards northwest of the attack site. Dr. Chen, armed with a tranquilizer rifle loaded with enough sedative to immobilize a 700-pound bear, immediately radioed the bear's location to Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien while preparing to engage the animal if it approached the recovery operation. The bear's appearance triggered immediate defensive measures as all personnel were ordered to consolidate at the helicopter landing zone. While armed officers prepared to engage if necessary, Bear 394 appeared to be testing the human response, moving closer to the activity before retreating back into cover when confronted by multiple personnel. This behavior pattern, described by Dr. Rodriguez as probing for weakness, indicated that the bear was actively hunting humans rather than simply defending territory. At 9:15 p.m., with weather conditions continuing to deteriorate and darkness approaching, the decision was made to evacuate all personnel and suspend recovery operations until the following morning. The brothers' remains were loaded aboard the first helicopter under heavy security escort, while equipment and personnel were redistributed among the 3 aircraft for safe evacuation. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien remained on scene with a 4-man armed team to maintain security overnight and prevent the bear from returning to feed on any remaining evidence. The overnight vigil proved both necessary and terrifying as Bear 394 made multiple approaches to the attack site throughout the darkness, apparently searching for the human remains that had been removed. Officer Chen, equipped with night vision equipment and a high-powered rifle, reported seeing the bear's heat signature moving within 50 yards of their defensive position on at least 6 separate occasions. The animal's persistent return to the area confirmed that it had developed a strong association between the location and human prey. Dr. Hendricks spent the night at the Valley County Emergency Operations Center, analyzing preliminary data and coordinating with bear behavior specialists from across North America. Her communications with Dr. Rodriguez at the USGS revealed that Bear 394's GPS collar had been transmitting location data throughout the attack period, providing unprecedented documentation of a grizzly bear's stalking and killing behavior. The data would later prove invaluable in understanding how large predators hunt humans in wilderness environments. The forensic analysis began at 6:30 a.m. on September 7th, when Dr. Williams commenced detailed autopsies of both brothers at the Idaho State Crime Laboratory in Meridian. Her examination was observed by wildlife forensics expert Dr. Caroline Rebecca Foster from the University of California, Davis, who had flown to Idaho specifically to assist with the investigation. Dr. Foster's expertise in predator attack patterns helped interpret the extensive trauma patterns found on both victims. Dr. Williams's autopsy of Frank Lewis revealed that he had sustained massive blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen during the bear's initial attack, resulting in multiple rib fractures, a ruptured spleen, and severe internal bleeding. However, the cause of death was determined to be massive blood loss from bite wounds to the neck and throat area, indicating that Frank had survived the initial impact and remained conscious during at least part of the mauling. The autopsy also revealed defensive wounds on Frank's hands and arms, showing that he had attempted to fight off the bear during the attack. Adam Lewis's autopsy showed even more extensive injuries, consistent with his having remained conscious and mobile for a longer period during the attack. His injuries included severe lacerations across the torso, a partially severed left arm, and massive trauma to the head and face from the bear's claws and teeth. The cause of death was determined to be massive blood loss, combined with traumatic brain injury from a crushing bite to the skull. Like his brother, Adam showed extensive defensive wounds, indicating a prolonged struggle with the attacking bear. Both autopsies revealed evidence of post-mortem feeding by the bear, including missing tissue from various body parts and bite marks consistent with feeding rather than attack behavior. Dr. Foster explained that bears typically begin feeding on their prey within minutes of a kill, and the feeding pattern observed on both brothers was consistent with predatory behavior rather than defensive attacks by a surprised or threatened animal. The investigation into Bear 394's history revealed a disturbing pattern of increasingly bold behavior around humans that had been developing for at least 2 years. Dr. Hendricks's research files contained multiple reports of the bear approaching campsites, breaking into food storage containers, and demonstrating unusually aggressive behavior toward humans who attempted to discourage its activities. Several previous encounters had resulted in property damage and forced evacuations, but no serious injuries had been reported prior to the Lewis brothers' deaths. Game Warden Captain Lisa Michelle Anderson, responsible for the sector containing the attack site, admitted during a press conference on September 8th that her department had received at least 7 reports of aggressive bear behavior in the area during the previous 18 months. However, budget constraints and personnel shortages had prevented intensive management efforts, and the decision had been made to monitor the situation rather than attempt capture and relocation of the problem animal. The revelation that wildlife officials had been aware of Bear 394's dangerous behavior sparked immediate controversy and demands for accountability from both the Lewis family and wilderness advocacy groups. Attorney David Michael Richardson, retained by the brothers' families, announced at a press conference on September 9th that legal action would be pursued against the Idaho Department of Fish and Game for negligent failure to protect public safety. Richardson's preliminary investigation suggested that the department had sufficient information to justify either relocating or destroying the bear before it killed anyone. The hunt for Bear 394 intensified on September 8th with the deployment of specialized tracking teams equipped with hounds trained specifically for locating dangerous bears. Master Hunter William Patrick O'Connor, contracted by Idaho Fish and Game for problem bear situations, arrived with his team of 6 tracking hounds and immediately began following the bear's trail from the attack site. O'Connor's 40 years of experience hunting problem bears throughout the American West made him the logical choice to lead the effort to locate and eliminate Bear 394. The tracking operation was complicated by the bear's apparent intelligence and understanding of human hunting tactics. Rather than following predictable travel patterns or returning to known feeding areas, Bear 394 seemed to be actively evading pursuit by changing direction frequently and using terrain features to mask its scent trail. O'Connor's hounds lost the scent on multiple occasions, forcing the team to establish new starting points and wasting valuable time that allowed the bear to increase its lead. On September 10th, the search was expanded to include helicopter-based reconnaissance flights covering over 200 square miles of wilderness terrain. Idaho Army National Guard pilots flew grid search patterns, while wildlife specialists used thermal imaging equipment to detect the bear's heat signature among the dense forest cover. The aerial search revealed numerous other bears in the area, but failed to locate the specific animal responsible for the Lewis brothers' deaths. The media attention surrounding the case intensified as national news outlets picked up the story and began broadcasting reports about the Idaho man-eater that had killed 2 experienced hunters. Television news crews from major networks established temporary operations in the town of Lowman, overwhelming the small community's limited infrastructure and creating significant disruption for local residents. The sensationalized coverage often ignored factual details in favor of dramatic speculation about killer bears roaming Idaho's wilderness areas. Local business owners experienced immediate impacts as tourists and hunters cancelled planned trips to the area, fearful of encountering dangerous wildlife. Lowman Lodge owner Susan Marie Patterson reported a 70% reduction in bookings within a week of the attack, forcing her to lay off seasonal employees and consider closing her establishment until the bear was captured or killed. Similar impacts were reported throughout the region as the economic consequences of the attack spread beyond its immediate location. The psychological impact on local residents proved equally significant as parents began restricting their children's outdoor activities and adults altered their own wilderness recreation patterns. Dr. Martinez, the clinical psychologist who had analyzed the brothers' stress responses, was contracted by the county health department to provide counseling services for community members experiencing anxiety related to the bear attack. Her initial assessment indicated that nearly 30% of local residents were showing symptoms of acute stress reactions. The Lewis family's grief was compounded by the intense media scrutiny and graphic details emerging from the investigation. Frank's widow, Jennifer Marie Lewis, struggled to cope with both her husband's death and the disturbing forensic evidence describing the manner of his killing. Her 2 young children, ages 7 and 5, required specialized counseling to help them understand their father's death without traumatizing them with unnecessary details about the bear attack. Adam's fiancée, Patricia Ann Williams, not related to the forensic pathologist, faced similar challenges in processing both her loss and the violent circumstances surrounding it. The couple had been planning a wedding for the following spring, and Patricia found herself having to cancel arrangements and notify vendors while simultaneously dealing with her emotional trauma. The support network provided by both families proved essential in helping her navigate the complex aftermath of such a public and violent death. The community memorial service held on September 12th at the Lowman Community Center drew nearly 800 people, including friends and family members who traveled from across the Pacific Northwest to pay their respects. The service was conducted by Pastor Robert James Morrison from Frank's Church in Meridian, who struggled to find appropriate words to comfort the families while acknowledging the violent nature of their loved ones' deaths. His message focused on the brothers' love of the outdoors and their strong family bonds, rather than the circumstances of their deaths. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan delivered a eulogy for Frank that emphasized his military service and dedication to his family, carefully avoiding graphic details of the bear attack while acknowledging the courage both brothers had shown in attempting to defend each other. Sullivan's speech was frequently interrupted by emotional outbursts from mourners who were struggling to process the shocking nature of the brothers' deaths. The Military Honor Guard's presentation of the American flag to Frank's widow was conducted with extra solemnity given the tragic circumstances of his death. The investigation took a significant turn on September 13th, when Bear 394's GPS collar transmitted its final signal from a location approximately 12 miles northeast of the attack site. The signal indicated that the collar had become stationary, suggesting either that the bear had died or that the collar had been damaged or removed. Wildlife officials immediately dispatched search teams to investigate the collar's location and determine the bear's status. The search team, led by Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien and Dr. Hendricks, discovered the collar attached to a tree branch approximately 8 feet above ground level. The collar's securing straps showed clear evidence of deliberate cutting, indicating that someone had removed the device from the bear and placed it in the tree to mislead investigators. This discovery transformed the search from a wildlife management operation into a potential criminal investigation, as interfering with wildlife research equipment constituted a federal crime. FBI Special Agent Catherine Lynn Rodriguez, no relation to Dr. Rodriguez, was assigned to investigate the collar tampering incident and determine whether federal wildlife protection laws had been violated. Her preliminary investigation revealed that removing or destroying wildlife research equipment carried potential penalties of up to $100,000 in fines and 5 years in federal prison. However, identifying the individual responsible for tampering with Bear 394's collar would prove extremely challenging given the remote location and lack of witnesses. The discovery that Bear 394 was no longer being tracked electronically significantly complicated the search effort and raised new concerns about public safety. Without GPS monitoring, wildlife officials had no way of knowing the bear's location or behavior patterns, making it impossible to warn the public about areas to avoid or predict where the animal might appear next. The situation created a climate of fear and uncertainty that persisted for weeks after the collar's discovery. Local law enforcement agencies increased patrols in wilderness areas and established a telephone hotline for reporting suspicious bear activity, but the vastness of Idaho's backcountry made comprehensive surveillance impossible. Sheriff McDonald estimated that providing adequate coverage of the search area would require over 200 additional personnel, far exceeding the resources available to local agencies. The state government was reluctant to fund such an extensive operation indefinitely, creating pressure to either locate the bear quickly or declare the search concluded. The pressure to find Bear 394 intensified when 2 hikers reported an aggressive encounter with a large grizzly bear near the town of Stanley, on September 18th. The hikers, Robert James Chen and Lisa Michelle Park, both experienced outdoors enthusiasts from Sun Valley, described being stalked and charged by a massive bear that matched Bear 394's description. They escaped injury only because Chen was carrying bear spray and managed to deploy it effectively when the bear approached within 10 feet of their position. Dr. Hendricks immediately responded to investigate the Stanley incident, collecting photographic evidence and DNA samples from claw marks left on trees near the encounter site. Her analysis confirmed that the Stanley bear was indeed a large male grizzly, but DNA comparison with samples from Bear 394 would require several days to complete. The possibility that the Lewis brothers killer was still actively hunting humans in the area created immediate demands for renewed search efforts and public safety measures. The DNA analysis results, released on September 22nd, confirmed that the bear involved in the Stanley incident was not Bear 394, providing some relief, but also raising new questions about the number of potentially dangerous bears active in central Idaho. Dr. Rodriguez's review of recent GPS collar data from other bears in the region revealed unusual movement patterns, suggesting that multiple animals had altered their normal behavior, possibly in response to increased human activity related to the search operations. The economic impact of the bear attack continued to expand as insurance companies began receiving claims from businesses affected by tourism losses and hunting guide services canceled due to safety concerns. The Idaho Outfitters and Guides Association estimated that the incident would cost the state's hunting industry over $3 million in lost revenue during the peak fall hunting season. These economic pressures created additional political demands for resolving the situation quickly and restoring public confidence in wilderness safety. The psychological trauma experienced by the search teams themselves became an unexpected aspect of the investigation as personnel involved in the recovery operation began showing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Specialist Davis, the combat medic who had conducted the initial assessment of the brothers' remains, was placed on medical leave after experiencing recurring nightmares and panic attacks related to the scene. Her condition highlighted the broader impact that such violent wildlife encounters have on first responders and investigators. Dr. Martinez expanded her counseling services to include law enforcement personnel, emergency responders, and wildlife officials involved in the case after identifying PTSD symptoms in multiple individuals. Her assessment revealed that witnessing the aftermath of predator attacks created unique psychological challenges that differed significantly from other types of traumatic events. The graphic nature of the brothers' injuries and the ongoing threat posed by the unlocated bear combined to create persistent anxiety and hypervigilance among those involved in the investigation. The search for Bear 394 was officially suspended on October 1st, following 3 weeks of intensive effort involving over 150 personnel and costing approximately $400,000 in state and federal resources. Governor Michael James Patterson announced the suspension during a press conference in Boise, emphasizing that the decision was based on professional recommendations from wildlife experts rather than budget considerations. However, the political pressure to end the expensive operation was evident to observers familiar with the state's financial constraints. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien's final report on the search operation documented the extensive efforts made to locate Bear 394, including over 200 hours of helicopter reconnaissance, deployment of specialized tracking teams, and investigation of 47 reported bear sightings throughout central Idaho. His conclusion that the bear had likely left the immediate area and posed no imminent threat to public safety was based on the absence of additional aggressive encounters and the animal's demonstrated ability to avoid human contact. The suspension of the active search did not end the investigation, as wildlife officials established a monitoring program designed to detect Bear 394's presence if it returned to the area or became involved in additional incidents. Trail cameras were deployed at over 100 locations throughout the region, and a reward fund of $25,000 was established for information leading to the bear's location. However, these passive measures provided little comfort to residents and visitors who remained concerned about their safety in bear habitat. The legal proceedings initiated by the Lewis family gained momentum in November when Attorney Richardson filed formal wrongful death lawsuits against both the Idaho Department of Fish and Game and the U.S. Forest Service. The lawsuits alleged that both agencies had failed to adequately warn the public about known dangerous wildlife in the area and had not taken appropriate action to remove or relocate problem animals. The cases demanded monetary damages exceeding $5 million per family and sought changes to wildlife management policies to prevent similar incidents. The state's defense strategy, developed by Assistant Attorney General Patricia Lynn Miller, focused on the inherent risks associated with wilderness recreation and the agency's limited resources for managing wildlife populations. Miller argued that both brothers were experienced hunters who understood the risks of their activities and that wildlife agencies could not be held responsible for the unpredictable actions of wild animals. However, the documented history of Bear 394's aggressive behavior created significant challenges for the defense team. The civil trial, scheduled to begin in April 2026, was expected to generate significant media attention and establish important precedents for wildlife management liability throughout the American West. Legal experts predicted that the outcome would influence how state agencies approach problem wildlife situations and could result in significant changes to public land management policies. The financial implications for Idaho's wildlife management budget were potentially enormous if the families prevailed in their lawsuits. The broader implications of the Lewis brothers' deaths extended far beyond Idaho, as wildlife agencies throughout North America began reviewing their policies for managing dangerous bears and other large predators. The incident highlighted the challenges of balancing wildlife conservation with public safety in an era of increasing human activity in wilderness areas. Several states initiated policy reviews and training programs designed to improve their responses to aggressive wildlife behavior. The National Park Service and U.S. Forest Service jointly funded a comprehensive study of human-bear interactions led by Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Hendricks, focusing on identifying early warning signs of dangerous behavior and developing intervention strategies to prevent attacks. The study, expected to take 3 years and cost over $2 million, represented the largest investment in predator behavior research in the agency's history. The Lewis brothers' deaths had created sufficient political pressure to fund research that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. Dr. Foster's analysis of the forensic evidence from the Lewis brothers' case became the basis for a new training program for wildlife officials throughout the western United States. Her detailed documentation of predator attack patterns and feeding behavior provided unprecedented insight into how large carnivores kill and consume human prey. While disturbing, this information proved essential for investigators who might face similar cases in the future and for developing prevention strategies. The psychological impact on the broader hunting and outdoor recreation community persisted long after the initial media attention faded. Hunting equipment retailers reported significant increases in bear spray sales and bear-resistant camping equipment throughout the fall hunting season. Many experienced outdoorsmen began altering their wilderness activities, traveling in larger groups and avoiding remote areas where they previously felt comfortable hunting or camping alone. The town of Lomond slowly recovered from the economic disruption caused by the bear attack, but the community's relationship with the surrounding wilderness was permanently altered. Local businesses adapted by offering bear safety courses and guided tours that emphasized wildlife awareness and safety protocols. The incident became a defining event in the town's history, referenced in conversations and planning decisions for years afterward. The anniversary of the Lewis brothers' deaths was marked on September 6, 2026, with a memorial service at the attack site that drew family members, friends, and wildlife officials from across the region. A bronze plaque was installed near Trail Creek, commemorating the brothers' lives and warning future visitors about the potential dangers of bear country. The memorial service was conducted with heightened security, as Bear 394 had never been located, captured, or confirmed dead. Dr. Hendricks continued her research on Bear 394's behavioral patterns, analyzing data from other GPS-collared bears to understand how the attack might have been predicted or prevented. Her work suggested that certain combinations of environmental factors and bear behavior could serve as warning indicators for potentially dangerous situations. However, implementing such monitoring systems on a practical scale would require resources and technology that remained beyond the reach of most wildlife management agencies. The Lewis family established a memorial foundation dedicated to wilderness safety education and bear research, funded through donations and speaking fees from Jennifer Lewis's presentations about her husband's death. The Foundation's programs focused on teaching outdoors enthusiasts to recognize and respond to dangerous wildlife situations, using Frank and Adam's story to illustrate the importance of proper preparation and situational awareness. Jennifer's courage in sharing her family's tragedy helped prevent additional deaths by educating thousands of wilderness users about bear safety. The case files for the Lewis brothers' investigation remained open, with periodic reviews conducted whenever new information became available about large bear activity in central Idaho. Several reported sightings of unusually large or aggressive grizzly bears were investigated as potential Bear 394 encounters, but none were confirmed through DNA analysis or other definitive evidence. The mystery of the bear's ultimate fate continued to generate speculation and concern among wildlife officials and local residents. The scientific legacy of the Lewis brothers' deaths included significant advances in understanding predator behavior and human-wildlife interactions. The detailed documentation of Bear 394's stalking patterns, combined with GPS tracking data and forensic evidence, provided researchers with unprecedented insight into how large predators hunt humans. This information contributed to improved safety protocols and prevention strategies that have likely saved lives in wilderness areas throughout North America. The emotional trauma experienced by the brothers' families, friends, and the broader community served as a powerful reminder that such violent encounters affect far more people than just the immediate victims. The ripple effects of predator attacks include PTSD among first responders, economic losses for local businesses, changes in recreation patterns, and lasting psychological impacts on entire communities. Understanding and addressing these broader consequences became an important aspect of wildlife management policy in the years following the attack. The story of Frank and Adam Lewis represents both the magnificent dangers of America's wilderness areas and the profound courage that ordinary people can display when facing extraordinary circumstances. Their final moments, spent attempting to defend each other against an overwhelming predator, exemplified the strong family bonds and mutual loyalty that had defined their relationship throughout their lives. While their deaths served as a tragic reminder of humanity's place in the natural world, their legacy continued through improved safety education and research that helped protect future wilderness adventurers. The investigation officially concluded on September 6, 2027, exactly 2 years after the attack, when the Idaho Department of Fish and Game issued its final report, acknowledging that Bear 394 would likely never be located or its ultimate fate determined. The report recommended significant changes to wildlife management protocols, including more aggressive intervention when bears display dangerous behavior toward humans, and improved coordination between agencies responsible for public safety in wilderness areas. These recommendations, implemented in response to the Lewis brothers' deaths, represented their lasting contribution to wilderness safety and wildlife management. The Lewis brothers' story continues to serve as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of wilderness recreation and an inspiration for those who refuse to let fear prevent them from experiencing the natural world's beauty and challenges. Their deaths marked a turning point in how wildlife agencies approach the management of dangerous predators, leading to policies and procedures that have undoubtedly prevented additional tragedies. While Frank and Adam Lewis paid the ultimate price for their love of the wilderness, their sacrifice contributed to making wild places safer for all who choose to venture into the magnificent and dangerous realm where humans and large predators continue to coexist in the American West.